Alright, welcome to Break Shift's Enlightened cards tier list. We're going to be doing this same way that we've done the tier lists for Hidden and Tempest. Make sure to check those out if you haven't seen them yet. We're going to rank them with respect to their rarity into the following tiers. S tier is going to be for cards that are pretty much auto-includes that you basically would put into any deck. A tier is going to be for the cards that form the backbone of your strategy. B tier is for cards that serve particular roles. So something like, just blocking, even if they're not particularly good at it, you do need cards that block. And C tier is going to be cards that are generally mediocre and not really worth using. Because there are 97, I think, total Enlightened cards, we're not going to be putting them onto a actual tier list. That would just be completely incomprehensible. We're just going to flash the letter on the screen as we pull up each card individually. So let's get started with Asceticism. Asceticism I'm going to put in B tier. Discard all non-attack cards in hand for each chain 1 and block 2. It's a pretty weird card. Upgrade gives you some rage for each card you discard as well. It effectively does two different things. It helps you deal with garbage cards, which is typically a problem that Enlightened has. He's not super good at that. And it can save you energy, sort of is the other way to look at it, because it costs 0 to play this card, and it puts you in Zen. Normally you have to spend energy on cards to go Zen, and then once you're in Zen, the payoff is usually the decreased cost of cards. So all of the benefits of this card, usually they just revolve around that energy. The block you're getting is not really substantial. So if you have a bunch of voids in your deck, or if you're going up against an enemy that spams you with lots of Banes or something, for example, like the Swamp Witch, then this is a pretty good card to tech in. Unless you just took a Dark Deal or something and have a bunch of voids, or maybe if you're playing with Original Sin or something. It's probably not something worth leaving in your deck at all times, but it's pretty good to tech in for the relevant fights. So, a solid B tier card, I would say. Next is Battle Insight. Battle Insight is also a B tier card. 2 cost for 5 Future Strike 2 times, and Vision 2 upgrades to be 5 Future Strike 3 times. So this is a 2-cost attack. Cards that cost more than 1 are quite a bit less valuable for Enlightened than they are for other characters inherently, just because 1-cost cards are that much easier to go Zen with, and once you're in Zen, 1-cost cards become free. And free cards, obviously, you can just play them whenever you want. You don't need to worry about it. Battle Insight's only going to cost 1, so you might not be able to have the energy, or you might have to choose between which cards you're going to play. So it's got that working against it, but that doesn't mean it's unplayable, of course. In this case, the Vision 2 is the effect that is most notable about this. It's a pretty average to mediocre damage dealer, but Vision's quite nice. There's not a ton of easily accessible ways to get it, if you're, especially if you're not on the starting deck that has the spell, which is Vision. If you're on the Martial starting deck, you have that Weaken and AoE She spell instead. And sometimes you'll really want Vision. At Common, this is a great way to pick some up. If you don't really need the Vision, probably don't waste your time with this guy. Next is Better Future. Better Future is our first A-tier card. Better Future is really good. 4-block Vision 1, upgrade the chosen card for the rest of battle. So, just like I was talking about, Vision is really good to have sometimes, and this is another decent way to get it at Common. If you upgrade it, you're getting 2 Vision, which is quite good, and you're getting 2 upgrades, which is actually a huge deal in the early game when the cards you're visioning are almost certainly not upgraded. Especially as a mastery pick, this is a really good mastery pick. If it's off cooldown, it's probably always at least worth considering. As the run goes on and you start to upgrade your more important cards, then the upgrading effect becomes less good because you want to be visioning those important cards, and those are the ones that you've probably already upgraded. So that line of text almost just vanishes once you get late enough in the run, but it's not completely useless. You could be in a situation like where you get a card pack or a card draft out of the Well of Stars at the end of the game before you fight the floor 3 guys. Maybe you get a really good card that you want to use, but it needs an upgrade. Well, Better Future can still be upgrading that for you, right? Maybe you get 1,000 Fists or something, and you don't have slow. Well, Better Future's got you covered there. It's the block value is adequate. It's not phenomenal, but it's okay. It compares reasonably well to repeating deflection in terms of the block you'll be getting on one turn or another, right? 3 on one turn versus 5 on the other turn. If you're not using both the immediate and delay block of repeating deflection, this is a pretty favorable comparison. So ends up being a very good card. Next, we've got one of the new ones, Branching Paths. Branching Paths, I'm going to put as a C tier, but that's kind of got an asterisk on it. Quite a few of the new cards were focused around afflictions, of course, and that's because, you know, they are a particular weakness of Enlightened, but also for people who want to play with what comes around, or what goes around, rather, where you get Banes when you shuffle your deck, or who want to play with the starting Voids, for people who wanted to go, like, above I-50 and stuff. If you didn't know, you can do that by editing your save file. Stuff like that, it's really, really hard to deal with those things as Enlightened, and so a lot of this stuff was somewhat catered specifically to, okay, well, if we assume that maybe you have some of these modifiers turned on, right? If you do not have those modifiers turned on, and I don't play with any of those on my standard I-50 setup, and I would advise other people to do the same, then this is not particularly good. If you don't have afflictions in your deck all the time, just like I was saying with asceticism, probably don't really care about this thing. And if you do have afflictions, it's usually your first order of business to get rid of them, go purge them at a shrine or whatever. This one's less good to tech in, I would say, compared to a card like asceticism. 1 energy to sift 2 is not a particularly useful effect. Getting Foresight is nice, of course, but since it's on a card in the discard pile, it can be quite a while until you actually get around to that card and get to save the energy. So it's of questionable value there. It's not a very good Foresight card compared to other common stuff like Clarity. It's quite a bit worse in that aspect, so you really have to be getting a lot of value out of the Sift. Usually you won't. In the right situation, this could be one of the best cards you could find, but that situation is not going to come up all that often, and you should be doing pretty much everything in your power to prevent that situation from coming up. I guess its best use case is probably if you're doing a challenge coin that has preset modifiers, and because of that you're stuck with Voids and Banes and such. Okay, next is Calm. So we were just talking about Foresight on common cards. This is quite a bit better Foresight on a common card than Branching Paths. It's a B tier here. So unupgraded, this card is actually pretty horrendous, I'm just going to say. An unupgraded Calm is trash for the most part, because it literally does not do anything on the first 2 turns of combat, unless you have some sort of way to generate fatigue, which you may or may not actually have. And if you do, at that point, you've probably upgraded the Calm. But usually when you find this thing unupgraded, it's blank on turn 1, it's blank on turn 2, and then there's a significant chance that on turn 3 it says Foresight 1, because you could very well be going up against a single target fight, or, you know, maybe you've killed off some of the enemies that would have fatigue at that point, and so it's only giving you 2 Foresight for 2, which is like, okay at that point, but you've had to wait 3 turns for it. It's not a very good look. If you upgrade it, though, then it just becomes 2 energy Foresight 2, and on rare occasion, maybe Foresight 3, and that's actually quite good at that point. 2 for 2 that you can use immediately, not a bad deal at all. The biggest comparison point, of course, is Clarity. Clarity is 1 for 1, Calm here being 2 for 2. But you've had to put an upgrade into this, so that kind of counteracts the benefits of this being a denser card. The fact that it's 2 cost does also have some weirdness involving Zen. It's not free in Zen. The upgrade on Clarity giving it Rig is a really nice deal because, of course, getting Foresight right at the start of the fight is the best time to do that. This thing actually asks you to put a green stone in it if you want to get the Foresight right away. Nevertheless, a green stone upgraded comm is pretty good. And even without that, there's a reasonable chance you just draw it relatively early on. If you need a lot of Foresight, you'll be pretty happy with a comm. If you just need a little bit of Foresight, you'll still be pretty happy with a comm if you can upgrade it. But it does absolutely demand an upgrade, so bear that in mind. Next up, Centipede Stance. Centipede Stance, I'm going to give it a C tier. It's a weird one. So this is one of Enlightened's non-expelling buffs. He's got a couple of those. That means that you can stack it up over and over again, and because it's 1 cost, it'll be free in Zen, so you can do Blackstone with it and just double play it in Zen easily. You've got Vision to recycle the buff. As soon as you play it, you put it back on top of the deck, and then you either do it again next turn or you draw it. There's obviously some pretty powerful synergies involving the chain, because it's normally hard to chain with buffs. There's that one relic that makes you instantly go Zen when you play a buff. There's the things that care about what kind of chain you have and tend to give pretty good benefits if you do a buff chain. So that's all worth considering. It's good with like Cultist Ward, of course. You can just reuse it over and over again, getting delay block 10. But that's all just kind of, you know, other stuff that relates to the fact that this is a 1-cost non-expelling buff. In terms of the actual text on the card, it's quite bad, actually. 1 Future Strike to all enemies is obviously not very much damage. It scales with fatigue, of course, but it's still only 1 Future Strike. You're just applying it more and more times. So the first time you get fatigue, you're doubling the damage, but then you're only going from 2 to 3 and then from 3 to 4. So each benefit is kind of smaller than the last if you're looking at it from like a percentage-based change. You really have to be spamming out a whole bunch of attacks for this to be dealing good damage. In the very early game, if you're on stabilities, then like it's tolerable, I guess. It does tend to fall off, and a lot of what I'm saying about Centipede Stance compares very poorly to Squid Stance, which we'll get to quite a bit later because we do these alphabetically, but Squid Stance has all the same incidental, like, you know, card quality things. It is a 1-cost buff that doesn't expel, and so all of the synergies that I was talking about with Centipede Stance work with Squid Stance. They're both common rarity. 99% of the time when I see a Centipede Stance, even if it's good, I wish it was a Squid Stance. And when it's good, it's usually more just because I have all these other things that are already decent themselves, you know, relics and such. And this is just kind of like a way to try and abuse them. And if you don't have those things, then the Centipede Stance is just not very useful. It could theoretically be like a win condition, I guess. There is a deck out there that could come into existence that needs Centipede Stance to deal the damage, but if you're able to spam out a whole bunch of attacks, your damage output is probably not, you know, that bad to begin with. So, like, if you're already killing things quickly, then this won't have time to ramp up. If you're not killing things quickly, you probably don't have that many attacks to spam, and so it's not actually going to trigger very often. Just a pretty conflicted card. Not very good. Next, we have Chaotic Blur. I am also going to give Chaotic Blur a C tier. I do not like this card. This card has 2 effects, and both of them are conditional. So, for 1 energy, you either play it as an opener, and you get 7 block and 1 slow, which is it's okay. That's not bad, I guess. It's nothing to write home about, but it's fine. Or you play it as a follow-up, so either right after an ability or while you're in Zen, and you get vulnerable too. And if you are playing it neither as an opener nor as a follow-up, it does nothing. 1 energy to nothing. It is very awkward. This card is pretty tricky to weave into your turn. It can be decent block, but it contests with all the other opener effects. Enlightened has some pretty good cards with opener, most notably, of course, if you have the She starting deck, you've got a ton of stabilities, which tend to be a very good opener effect. And even if you're on the Marshall deck, you do have those gaining momentums. That's a really valuable opener effect too that's going to contest the Chaotic Blur. And any other openers you pick up from there just make this thing harder to justify. The follow-up is Vulnerable, which is only useful if you're dealing physical damage, so it doesn't work with She, and roughly half of the time you're going to be using She, assuming that you play the decks evenly and you don't just go Marshall all the time. So that means that quite often Chaotic Blur is very bad. In the instances where the Chaotic Blur is not very bad, in the instances where you're on the Marshall deck and you don't have a lot of opener effects and you value the Vulnerable, then it's okay. Even in like the best case scenario, it's just okay. Especially of note is the fact that it's only 2 vulnerable. Because Future Strike triggers every other turn, if you want to guarantee that they'll be vulnerable while they're taking Future Strike damage, you need to be applying enough vulnerable to last from one turn to the next. If you play with Adaptation on like I do, then 2 vulnerable does not work past the first turn where Future Strike is triggering, right? Turn 2, the 2 vulnerable is good because Adaptation hasn't kicked in. By turn 4, the Adaptation has kicked in, so trying to apply Vulnerable 2 to somebody on turn 3 is not going to stick around for that Future Strike trigger, which means you need to upgrade this thing so that you get Vulnerable 3. The opener block is actually pretty decent at that point, but you are still asking, you're being asked to put an upgrade point into this common card that can do literally nothing sometimes, and that just has a lot of awkwardness around it. If you draw into it in the middle of a turn on a situation where you need a block, you're going to be really upset. If you don't have the right cards to go Zen with abilities, then you're going to be upset. Just usually not very good. It has its use cases, but they're pretty few and far between. Next is Clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is also C tier, if you ask me. A lot of C tiers here. This one is, again, the best thing about this card is that it says Vision too, and sometimes you'll really want Vision, but this is usually not a very great way to get it. 2 for 2 Vision is, like we saw Battle Insight 2 for 2 was fine, but Battle Insight was dealing 5 Future Strike twice. In this one's case, you're getting 10 delay block, and that doesn't sound so bad, right? Like, that's, if you play 2 repeating deflections, you get 10 delay block. This is, 2 energy, you're getting 10 delay block, right? But the fact of the matter is, it's a lot harder to find 2 energy laying around to spend on a defensive card that doesn't do anything immediately for your defense. In theory, the idea that you're getting delay block and vision at the same time is good, because that means that you're accounting for your defense's next turn, and so maybe you can spend the vision putting back some powerful attack cards, I guess. But 10, while it's like a pretty reasonable amount, is probably not going to be all of the block you need for the turn. So in all likelihood, you will still need to be playing some defensive cards, which just makes it that much more awkward. This is one of my least favorite sources of vision. Nevertheless, it is vision, so if you need vision, don't be too picky. Take this thing if it's going to get the job done in that regard. But, yeah, it's kind of the bottom of the barrel in terms of common vision. Next we have Clarity, and Clarity is great. Clarity is an A-tier card. This is just like, textbook bread and butter card for the Enlightened. It is almost always good in just about any deck. It's a great mastery pick. It's a highly flexible card. The ability to upgrade it for Rigged, as I was talking about while we were discussing Calm, very good upgrade. It's a solid stone carrier. I really like to put purple stone in this thing personally, but you can do plenty of other stuff too. You can do black stone with it to like build your own Calm in a way that's better for chain, because you're getting 2 chains instead of 1. It's really easy to get your hands on this thing usually. I often have runs with like 3 or 4 copies of this thing, and you'll definitely want to play at least one, like 90% of the time. Because you're probably going to have at least one card that costs, 2 or 3. If you're on the Marshall starting deck, Foresight's really good on building momentum, or gaining momentum, yeah. It's really nice when you eventually do find some of those 2 or 3 cost attacks, something like a Unbalanced Fury or whatever, really, really nice with clarity. It's just a good card. If you've spent any amount of time playing Enlightened, I'm sure you would agree. Next, we have Clear Image. Clear Image is another C tier card. This one is, so for 1 energy, 3 Shi 2 times, and if it's the opener, you get 1 Foresight. So, we were just looking at a card that was 1 energy for 1 Foresight. This is the same thing, but you get damage, right? And instead of upgrading to Rig, this one upgrades to get more Shi. The problem with this is that opener clause. As I mentioned, both of the starter decks have some pretty high value opener cards. In particular, those stabilities. It's always nice to use stabilities to go Zen. And having to contest with that is not good. The fact that you can draw into this in the middle of a turn is not good. It makes the Foresight unreliable, and normally Foresight is supposed to be a way to improve your deck's reliability, because you can guarantee that you play your particular power cards when you draw them, right? If your plan for damage is an Unbalanced Fury, Clarity says, unless you draw that Unbalanced Fury in the opening hand, you will always be able to play it whenever you draw it, right? Because it'll cost 0. Clear Image does not say that, because not only is it not rigged, so you don't have that going for you, but if you draw into this in the middle of a turn, which is far from outrageous, you have several things that can draw you cards in the middle of the turn on Enlightened. Obviously your Prayer Beads, obviously the gaining momentum effect, Stoicism, plenty of other stuff. Then suddenly you're completely unable to get your Foresight down, which means that card is still going to be full cost, which means you might not be able to play it when you draw it. So it dramatically increases the inconsistency of your deck compared to different Foresight options. This one pretty much is in the same bucket as Clairvoyance. If you want Foresight, don't be too picky. Take this thing if you don't have any other choices, but it is pretty much the bottom of the barrel Foresight card. Next, we've got Cohesion, and Cohesion is B tier. 1 energy, block 7. Zen, if you have 0 energy, gain 1. The upgrade is just +3 block. Pretty simple card. Not too much to say about this one. If you ignore the Zen line of text, it's still probably a significant upgrade over a repeating deflection, so you will probably just slot this in when you find it early. Sometimes you can squeak a little extra energy out of it, and that's pretty decent value. It's not gonna, you know, bring the house down or anything, but it's fine. Just a very okay card. Next is Combination Strike. Combination Strike's pretty solid. Another B tier one. 4 Future Strike twice for 2 energy is a little bit below the curve in terms of damage, but follow-up draw 1 is a very nice line of text. Upgrading it to 4 times 3 pretty much just keeps in pace with other damage upgrades in terms of the increase. This is never going to be like a huge damage dealer. It really is all about that follow-up effect. This pairs really well with a lot of those opener attacks on Enlightened, right? Like, this goes very well with gaining momentum. This goes very well with stability. So, for all of the complaining I was doing about the other opener attack cards, this is the opposite. This is great with all of those things. Card draw is really nice. Being able to use it in tandem with vision and stuff is cool. Just being able to cycle through your deck faster is great, of course. It is a 2-cost card, so it has that working against it, but, you know, since you are drawing a card, it can sort of refund the energy sometimes. Usually you're, like, reasonably happy to use this in the early game, and maybe you want it in the late game, maybe you don't. But it's at the very least worthy of a B. Next we have Deceleration. And Deceleration is probably one of the worst cards in the game. This is one of those things where if I was so inclined, I would probably just have a D just for this. D for Deceleration, right? But no, we'll keep ourselves to just S through C. Deceleration's terrible. Apply 1 slow. If the target is already slow, apply weak 2 as well. And the upgrade makes it apply vulnerable on the conditional effect. So, Slow in Vault of the Void is a very weird effect. There are some enemies that just get completely shut down by slow because they attack many times. And the fact that slow stacks the way it does, like if you have 5 slow on someone, they're losing 5 frenzy one turn, 4 the next, and 3 after that, and so on and so forth. That's obviously a huge number, but, you know, just for the example. Point being, slow can be really good, right? More often than not, though, slow is really not good. There are lots of enemies that only attack for 1, and there's plenty of other situations where the amount of slow that you can apply makes it a pretty unfavorable comparison to just getting direct block, right? We just saw a card that was 1 energy block 7 and sometimes refunded you an energy. Pretty frequently, you're not going to be getting 7 block worth of value out of 1 energy apply 1 slow. So that's not a very favorable comparison. This conditional effect, applying only if they're already slow, means you have to be playing other slow effects, which you probably don't want to do. It's not extremely easy to come by good slow. The fact that the upgrade only applies the conditional effect, not great. The base conditional effect just being additional attack reduction debuffs is not really all that great, because you probably don't need to like further weaken them in that case if you're already slowing them down and you've got energy to waste on another effect like this. You'd probably rather just be doing something more proactive in terms of progressing the fight. The fact that you're not getting that slow if they're already slow, like the value out of it is wasted a lot of the time for enemies that have 2 frenzy as well as enemies that have 1 frenzy now, right? Because it's 1 slow and then another slow that just extends the duration of it, which does nothing against 1 frenzy enemy. Against 2 frenzy enemies, it lets it last 1 more turn, but it's just really, really difficult to get the value out of this thing. It really is. Very frequently, it's just like the worst block card, and it's not going to apply debuffs. I don't like this thing at all in like 700-800 hours of Vault of the Void. I think I'm near 800 now. I've used this card maybe once, and it was bad. It's just so terrible. Not used it as in like, you know, actually made use of it. I've certainly put it in the deck and tried to, you know, give it a fair shake, but it just sucks. It's just so terrible. Next we have Decline, another one of the new cards. I'll put this one in B tier. 5 Future Strike 1 time, Zen Sift 1, Chain 1 if you have an Affliction in hand. Quite a lot of text on this guy. None of it's like super crazy, just a lot of decent effects that come together to make a decent card. 5 Future Strike 1 time is a good number for scaling with fatigue. This thing scales up pretty quickly. Very favorable with that, even if it's a bit less damage immediately. Zen Sift 1 is a rather strange line of text to have, but you could probably make use of it at pretty much any point in the game. If you just randomly get a Sift effect, you know, you can just look at the draw pile and say, what do I want to draw the least out of these? And there's probably always one card that you wouldn't mind just, you know, binning. So that's nice. It's just a little bonus. We'll take it, right? Chain 1 if you have an Affliction in hand. This is not an effect that will come up very often because it's just not particularly likely that even if you have Afflictions in the deck, you'll draw them at the same time as Decline. In theory, you could, like, set this up somehow. You could, like, you know, vision on a turn when you're getting dazed or something. But more often than not, it's just randomly sometimes, if there are Afflictions in the fight or in your deck, this will just suddenly become a really good card. Because when you're getting that chain effect, it's actually very powerful. And you'll be really glad you have this, because it's harder than ever to go Zen when one of your cards is an Affliction, and this just immediately solves that. The upgrade is 6 Future Strike 1 time, which is, like, that's fine. And Sift 2 in Zen, which, again, it's fine. For as unusual of a card as this seems like when you read it with all the, you know, the weird stuff it has going on, it ends up just mostly being a beat stick. But, you know, when those random situations come up and you really do need the chain or you really do need the Sift, it's pretty cool. So, you'll be glad you have it in those cases, even if you do end up cutting it a lot of the time as the run progresses. Next, we have Delay. Oh, every single card with Delay block is going to come up. Okay, well, we'll just focus in on this one. Delay says apply slow 1 to all enemies, and if it's solo, delay block 4. That's a C tier. So I was harping pretty hard on on the Deceleration for being a bad card. This applies slow 1 to all enemies instead of just one. So, like, I guess in theory that should make it better, but the fights where you can take advantage of slow are already pretty few. The fights where you can take advantage of AoE slow are even fewer. And obviously, if you're just fighting one enemy, then this is just a strict upgrade to Deceleration, if they're not already slow, that is, right? You're getting 1 slow and 4 delay block instead of just 1 slow. So that's, like, nice, I guess, in theory. Again, this really is just one of those cards where it's like, in practice, you will be shocked at how infrequently you actually make use of this thing. Just not a very good card. Everything I said about Decelerate, for the most part, continues here. And it applies in general to why slow is not actually a very valuable effect to have, especially ever since Corpse Mound went from being like 12 by, or what was it? Was it 10 by 2 base to now he's just attacking by 1 for twice as much. That used to be like the reason you wanted slow, was to shut down Corpse Mound, but you can't even do that anymore. So slow is just not super valuable. If a card is applying slow, you probably want it to be doing something else that's of very significant value before you really start considering that. Delay is not doing much of significant value, so C tier. Next, we've got Deliberate, and Deliberate's pretty solid. Deliberate's a B tier card. 8 2 times is not a particularly good damage spread for scaling, because the 8 is what will increase with fatigue. So it scales up somewhat slowly, although the upgrade does remedy that to a degree. 7 times 3 ends up being quite a bit more damage, just straight up, of course, and in terms of scaling. And then that Zen conditional block 9 or upgraded block 13. It might be a little surprising to realize how much value you can get out of this thing. Obviously, as a 3 cost, it's very expensive. 8 Shi 2 times doesn't seem like a ton of damage. But if you just have any foresight at all, you slap foresight on this thing, and it is going to put in a lot of work. The fact that it is a block card is pretty relevant, so any of the interactions where you could, like, double a block card or draw cards when you play block cards or whatever, make it pretty nice with Deliberate. It's not as difficult as you would expect to make the block actually work in your favor. And especially upgraded, the damage it's tolerable, even without Foresight. And with Foresight, it's quite good, especially because, it's a common card, very easy to get your hands on, very good to pair with some of those common sources of Foresight, especially Clarity, which you may well have taken as your starting bonus. This is a really good way to chunk through early elites. Just a solid, solid card. Next, we have Discipline. And Discipline is another B tier card. It's been a while since we've seen an A or higher, huh? Discipline is... It's an aggressively okay card. Just so little of interest about this thing. It's repeating deflection but bigger. It's got this goofy follow-up effect. Some people really like this a lot. I know DeBoer says that he really likes this effect and stuff. I don't. I've had a lot of people try to pill me on this thing with the delay, the follow-up for Rage. But if you're playing an ability and then playing another 2-cost ability, like, that's a lot of your energy already spent for the turn doing things that don't deal damage. Now you've got to, probably finish going Zen, but with a 3rd ability, and then try to take advantage of that Rage. How many cards do you have left in hand? How much energy do you have to spend on them, potentially? Probably not very much. So I do not like it. I don't think it's very good, at least the follow-up effect. What I do think is alright is 7 block and 9 delay block. It's not exciting, but it's okay. The upgrade improves it. I'm really glad that none of the value of the upgrade goes into that follow-up effect, because you should probably just ignore that follow-up effect for the most part when you're playing this card. Once in a blue moon, you'll be able to take advantage of it, and it'll deal a smidgen of extra damage. But more often than not, this is just a denser block card. Sometimes you need that. It's more immediate block than a lot of the other options you might have. So that can be nice, right? It's more than twice as much immediate block as the repeating deflection. That's good. and allows you to play a little more reactively. Sometimes you need to be able to do that. B tier, B tier. Next we have fast forward. We can just leave the B up because fast forward is also B tier. This one is quite a bit more interesting than a lot of the other B tiers at the very least. 1 for 6 is not a phenomenal deal in terms of block, but the fact that you're getting to turn delay block into immediate block and getting double value out of that is pretty interesting. There's some really nice ways to utilize this on turns when you're just playing your repeating deflections for immediate block and you're not even being attacked next turn and you feel very sad. Fast forward will make you feel a lot less sad. The upgrade on it makes it 8, which is more respectable, and letting you get rid of 1 additional delay block. It's okay. It's not the best upgrade in the world, but this is another one of those block cards where it's just like almost certainly better than one of your repeating deflections early on, and potentially might end up being a really good card by the later game. It's really good with Squid Stance, for example. It can be good with some of the relics that give you delay block, so something like the Echo Cloak, for example. Something like the Hand Mirror, right? There's a number of ways to take advantage of it. Pretty decent. And I guess we'll continue to leave the B up because the next card is also B. It's Frustration. Frustration is a very funky card. It's an ability that deals Shi, so it won't scale with Rage. 4 Shi 3 times is really good for a 1-cost card. But then it has Desync. Desync is like a horrible line of text. Very, very bad for your card when it has Desync for the most part. And this does not remove the Desync on upgrade, unlike a couple other cards in Enlightened's pool. So you will have to contend with that no matter what. If this thing has a follow-up, you get 100% Rage, you exit Zen, you reset your chain. So if you're in Zen, you're not in Zen anymore. If you weren't in Zen, your chain is back to square one. The whole point of this card is just to be able to take advantage of turns when you weren't going Zen anyway, right? If you have the classic 2 abilities, 2 attacks because you were crippled or because you drew an affliction or because you drew a buff, then this is pretty solid. You can play the first ability, play the Frustration, and now you've got 100% Rage to use with those 2 attacks. You weren't going Zen anyway, so you don't care about the other downsides, right? It sounds pretty decent. A lot of the time, though, you will find that the card itself is the source of frustration because the damage it deals falls off since, it doesn't scale with Rage. The desync, it gets worse and worse as your deck becomes more consistent over the course of the run, which hopefully it is doing. You're going to have more and more opportunities to go Zen, and less often will you want to utilize this thing. The other use case it has is always just like at the end of your turn as the last card you play. You just dump this thing out because it is still, relatively speaking, a high amount of Shi, right? And then you're exiting Zen, but you don't care. You don't use the Rage either. That's not like a super great way to use this thing, if you ask me. I pretty much exclusively use this as an early game beat stick, and I cut it pretty quickly. Oftentimes before the first boss, I'm already over the frustration. But, it's got its uses. It will help you clear those early elites. It might be able to stick around. I think this is just a pretty good showcase in general, though, of why desync is a pretty tough keyword to contend with. Alright, finally time to take that B down. The next card is not a B. It's Gaining Momentum, a card you've heard me talk about a couple times already. Gaining Momentum gets to be A tier. It is actually a very good starter card. Like, actually impressively powerful. 4 Future Strike 2 times is whatever damage. It's not very impressive. It's less than you would expect for 2 cost, but it's because if you do this as an opener, you're drawing a card and gaining some Rage. So you compare this thing to Combination Strike. It's the same damage, 4x2, the same ability to draw a card, but you get a bonus 25% Rage. That's pretty nice. Obviously, it's an opener instead of a follow-up. But the big reason why opener is a problem is because it contends with other opener effects. And this is one of the other opener effects that your things are usually contending with, because you start with 2 of these. So it kind of has like a leg up on the competition in that regard, because it doesn't have to be compared against anything from the get-go. If you upgrade it, you get 50% rage and a little bit of extra damage. That's a pretty good upgrade. Because the Future Strike is the amount that is increasing, that means that it's going to scale better. This is a great target for Foresight, right? Like if you take Clarity as your mastery pick, very often you're going to be using Clarity to hit Gaining Momentum if you chose that starter deck. Because just being able to guarantee that when you start your turn, you can just throw that thing out immediately, get the draw, get the rage. Really, really good. The ability to draw into more attacks to complete the Zen entry is pretty handy with this thing. It's just very nice. Very, very nice card. Easy to take advantage of. Next, we've got Jack of All. Jack of All is such a weird card. It gets to be B tier. Obviously, as the name implies, it's a little bit of everything. You get a little Future Strike in a way that scales well. You get a little She in a way that does not scale reasonably well. You get 3 block, and you get 3 delay block. So if you ask me, the best way to look at this card is as a block card, primarily. That 3 block and 3 delay block are pretty significant compared to the amount of damage you're getting out of this thing. If you upgrade it, you're getting +1 to all of the numbers. So that doesn't really change the math on how this card works for the most part. If you need a bit more defense, but you don't want to alter your balance of attacks and abilities for the purposes of going Zen, then this is a really great way to do that. If you just want to swap this in over something like a Repeating Deflection early on, because it's going to help you kill an elite a bit more, you know, it can help you out in that regard. But you know, you will probably be cutting this thing sooner or later. If you're like really heavy on attacks, then maybe this sticks around into the late game, just, you know, for Zen entry purposes. But realistically, probably not. It's just it's a decent card for the early game, and then you get rid of it. And that makes it B. Next, we have Lash and Kick. Lash and Kick is also an A tier card, I'm gonna say. Kind of weird. You see a lot of the commons we have not rated particularly highly, but a lot of the starting cards are getting pretty favorable ratings here. Lash and Kick at 3 Future Strike twice for 1 is pretty whatever. Not very impressive. You could find a lot of other cards where the going rate is 4 Future Strike 2 times for 1. So not a super favorable comparison there. The upgrade going to 3 Future Strike 3 times, that's not how you want your Future Strike to upgrade. Makes the scaling less impressive, but Zen Slow 1, right? I've been talking so much crap about slow. Well, in the same way that that Sift effect on Decline was nice, because it just kind of randomly pops up as a bonus sometimes, this being just a bonus effect in your head is what you should be thinking of it as, and that makes it quite good. In the fights where you don't need slow, you don't care. You're just playing this for damage. In the fights where you do need slow, suddenly you have this ridiculous way to stack up a lot of slow, and that can be very good in the right situation. It is, funnily enough, better a lot of the times to trigger the slow synergies that Enlightened has access to, more so than just to get slow itself. Like the classic combo, of course, Back in Time with Lash and Kick is crazy. You know, you throw a blindfold in the mix or something, you get some spicy stew cooking up there. Pretty unique options that become available with that Zen effect. So for that reason, I actually am going to put it in A tier. Even into the late game, it's not at all uncommon to want to leave a couple Lash and Kicks in there just for that Zen. So, you know, because the damage, like I said, it's not as good as a lot of other cards, but it's not like it's abysmal. It's tolerable damage, and you might be able to do some really neat stuff with that Zen effect. So, A tier as far as starting cards go. Because remember, we are evaluating things within their rarity, and starting is, you know, effectively its own rarity. You can't find these cards generated on the floor. If you didn't know, you can tell that when a card has the stars for its rarity empty. 1 empty star means that this is a card that will not generate on the floor, naturally. So I'm effectively considering that its own tier of rarity. Anyway, next we have the counterpart to Jack of All, Master of None. Master of None is, it fares pretty similarly. It's going to be in the same tier, B tier. I would say that Master of None is quite a bit worse in the early game and quite a bit better in the late game. So I guess they continue to be counterparts outside of just the name, but in their actual use cases. Master of None in the early game is just, like, outrageous. You look at it and you have to spend 2 energy for these effects. Like, this is not worth 2 energy, right? But then by the late game, you might actually find a lot of value in this. Foresight and Vision at the same time, pretty handy. The slow, we don't really care about all that much for reasons we've discussed. And if you upgrade this thing, you're getting Echo Wall 1. That's pretty valuable, actually. The late game enemies hit hard, and so they hit themselves hard back with Echo Wall. That's nice. And you may have a variety of synergies for Echo Wall. You know, something like a reverb, if you're lucky. Makes it pretty good. It doesn't end up making the cut a lot of the time, but it can still be very powerful if you don't have an easy way to gain Foresight and Vision, right? Like, we were talking about, oh, maybe you really need Clairvoyance just for the Vision, right? Or maybe you just need this, the Clear Image for the Foresight or whatever, right? If you're considering between, like, mediocre options for one or the other, why not consider a pretty okay option for both, right? That's a much better deal. It's still tough to weave into a lot of turns, but when the time is right, it does perform. Next, we've got Mind Blast. Mind Blast, I will also put in B tier. Mind Blast is one of those rare 0-cost cards for Enlightened. Deal 3 Shi 2 times, desync, upgrades to lose desync. So it's a very powerful way to aid yourself in Zen entry after you've got that upgrade. And outside of that, it is garbage. This card is really, really, really bad unupgraded. And even upgraded, it's only, like, okay. The best thing to be doing with Mind Blast, and this is all going to hold true of Swift Kick when we get to that as well later, is you upgrade it so that it doesn't have desync, you put a Blackstone on it, and you get 2 chains for 0 energy. That is pretty dang strong, right? That is a lot better than what you're going to be able to do with something like Asceticism. If you just want to go Zen quickly, if you have cards with, like, a lot of Zen conditionals, if you have expensive stuff that you need to save energy on, a Blackstone upgraded Mind Blast or Swift Kick will certainly get you there. Very, very powerful way to manage your energy in fights. But they're really kind of just one-trick ponies in that regard. There's almost nothing else worth doing with a Mind Blast or a Swift Kick than exactly upgrading them and putting a Blackstone in them. And, you know, upgrade points are pretty valuable. Blackstones are pretty valuable. There might be other stuff that you would really like to put those resources into. So, it's certainly not a card that you always want to make use of. But given how strong it can be when you do end up committing those resources to it, I do think it warrants a B tier, even if I just end up letting these rot in the backpack a lot of the time. I've had more than enough runs that used the Mind Blasts and the Swift Kicks to great effect to say it's at least worth a B tier. Okay, next is Mirror Guard. And Mirror Guard is fantastic. It's an A tier card. I am a known Mirror Guard lover. This card is just really, really handy, especially early on in the game. So it's great as a mastery pick. 2 for 12 block is pretty alright, but the 1 Echo Wall is really handy. It's going to deal quite a bit of damage for you in the early game. It's great versus early elites. It's great with the Echo Wall synergies. Upgrade it 2 for 17, quite respectable actually. This is like a reasonable Foresight target early on. Just a very nice card all around. Towards the real tail end of your run, you might end up wanting to cut this thing. Because the numbers on it do get outclassed by other stuff, but it takes quite a while for this thing to become bad. definitely worthy of A tier, and that doesn't even happen all the time, right? I've won a lot of runs with Mirror Guard still in the deck. Next we've got Multitask. Multitask is also going to be B tier. This one is a pretty weird card. So 4 Future Strike 2 times, as I mentioned when talking about Lash and Kick. This is kind of a standard amount of damage. Nothing particularly impressive. And then it's got this really weird other effect. Per 15 Shi delay block 1, maximum of 25 delay block. You will almost never be reaching that cap. But even if you're only getting a smidgen of delay block out of this thing, it's really not that bad, right? If you're getting, say, 4 delay block out of this, that's pretty okay. 4 Future Strike 2 times and 4 delay block, that's not bad. But where this card really shines, of course, is at the very end of a run. Versus the Void, versus those super high health guys like the Death Knight, and other really chunky enemies like that. It's a lot of defense, and it's pretty respectable damage, right? It's also more or less just an upgrade over at least one copy of like a Lash and Kick. So, you know, you can just kind of slot it in when you find it early in those cases. It is probably worth playing at least some amount of Future Strike most of the time if you're starting on the Shi deck too, so you can slot it in over stability pretty easily. And obviously when you have the Shi starting deck, you have more Shi to maximize the delay block. A marginal upgrade perhaps a lot of the time, but you know, that's good enough. Marginal upgrade most of the time into huge defensive powerhouse versus the Void. That's pretty good. I'd say that warrants a B tier. Next up, we've got No Condo. No Condo will also be B tier. This is another buff. This one does expel. Each time your deck is reshuffled, Echo Wall 1 for 1 energy. It might not seem like that's a lot of value. And usually at the very beginning of the run, it's pretty bad. And it gets better and better as you cycle your deck more and more, which you can end up doing quite a lot. You can end up cycling your deck once per turn on average or more. But what's really crazy about No Condo is the upgrade. -1 cost and rigged. That's a hell of an upgrade, man. That's a really strong upgrade. It lets you put a Blackstone in it super easily, which goes great with any other rigged buff because you can just double No Condo for 0 energy, and then you play a third buff. You've gone Zen. You've used a buff chain that might be relevant for relics and stuff, as we've mentioned. And now you're getting 2 Echo Wall every time you shuffle your deck, which is like actually pretty good. It's really great with Reverb and other Echo Wall synergies because it's just a constant passive source of Echo Wall that you got really cheaply. It's pretty good filler, especially if you've upgraded up. It's great filler if you've upgraded it. Just a nice card. Just a very nice card. Next we have Now and Then. And I really like Now and Then, actually. I'm going to give Now and Then an A tier. Now and Then has 3 conditional effects, right? I was pretty harsh on Chaotic Blur with its 2 conditional effects, but Now and Then has so many different ways that you can use it, right? Like, so Opener Block 10 is pretty decent. That's a lot better than Opener Block 7 on an upgraded Chaotic Blur. Follow-up Delay Block 6. It's consistent with its uses, right? You can get Block Now, which makes it a good defensive option, or you can get Block Later, which makes it a good defensive option, whereas Chaotic Blur has this dual modality to it. It's, you know, if you just say, I need more defense, you can't just slot in a Chaotic Blur, because it's not always going to be defense. You can always slot in a Now and Then if you need more defense, and then it's just up to you to decide now or later. And with that rebound effect, being able to get the delay block twice, 12 delay block, and you'll have spent 0 energy on it because in Zen, of course, it goes down to 0 cost. That's very powerful indeed. I like this card a lot. The upgrade on it is quite nice, actually. 3 immediate block and 2 delay block, which can get doubled, of course, with the rebound. It's a great stone carrier because of the rebound effect. You put a yellow stone in here, and then you're either playing it for 14 or using the follow-up to get 4 block and 6 delay block up to twice. Pretty potent. I really like Now and Then. Next up, we have One Step Ahead, and One Step Ahead is going to be another B tier one, back to B tier. 1 for 6, as mentioned with Fast Forward, not super impressive, but instead of the ability to gain more immediate block, this one has the ability to gain you some delay block per stack of fatigue. So of course that's 0 delay block sometimes, and that makes One Step Ahead look pretty sad. But by the time you've got even just 1 stack of fatigue, this is pretty respectable. 6 and 4 is not at all bad. It's way better than a repeating deflection, obviously. And against later fights where the fatigue will have stacked up longer, or once you've gotten some fatigue application from relics or something, it starts to look quite a bit better. The upgrade on this thing, making it delay block 9 immediately, also helps mitigate some of the issues it has early in fights. Not a standout card by any stretch, but pretty solid and usually an upgrade over one of the other defensive cards you have access to. Now we have Opposing Force. Opposing Force is also going to be B tier. It's pretty comparable to Battle Insight. Battle Insight was 2 energy, 5 Future Strike twice, Vision 2. This is exactly the same, but instead of Vision 2, it's got Opener Echo Wall 2. And if you upgrade it, it drops the Opener condition and becomes 6 Future Strike twice. So that's like a pretty decent upgrade, getting rid of the Opener effect. 2 Echo Wall from 1 card is not bad. That's not particularly easy to get, actually. Most cards just give 1 Echo Wall at a time. So if you want to have a lot of Echo Wall for whatever reason, this is a decent way to get that. I can't say that just having a bunch of Echo Wall in general is usually like a strat you want to go for. You kind of do need a particular reason, some sort of synergy. You know, like a Phantom Spike or a Reverb or whatever. So, as just like a general use case card, it's not the best. But if you are like, if you don't have a lot of opener effects, maybe you've cut some of those cards for one reason or another, or you just really do want that Echo Wall, you'll like Opposing Force, and the damage is fine. I'm never very enthused about Opposing Force, to be quite honest. I don't hate it. I don't love it. B tier. Next we've got Outpace. This is a card that I do love. Outpace gets an easy A. Very nice card. It's just a huge chunky block. 2 for 15 is quite a good deal, and you're usually going to be getting some bonus block, right? So most often that'll be +3 from 3 enemies with 1 stack of fatigue each. In really long fights, it scales up, but the scaling of this thing is just okay. It's not particularly good, so mostly it's just nice as a big chunky block. You know, this is really, really good versus those early elites. This is really good versus bosses before you've like put together a more comprehensive solution, right? That floor 1 boss, you're probably just gonna be more than happy to play Outpace for 15. That's really all there is to say about it. It's just pretty good. Next we've got Persist. And Persist is an A tier card. Persist is really strong. It's just a handy dandy ability to be able to draw a card with an attack that costs 1, good for chaining, good to put Blackstones in. Decent way to spread some Shi around. The upgrade is pretty unimportant, to be honest. It's okay, right? Going from 4 Shi to 6 Shi with better scaling base. That's nice. But you don't really care about it all that much. For the most part, this is just a really good way to manage your chain, right? It helps you do follow-ups. It helps you go Zen in general. It helps you with draw consistency because it replaces itself, so lets you find your most important cards more reliably. It is almost always useful. Almost always. Obviously, the biggest downside is that if the enemies don't have fatigue, it's just 1 mana, deal 4 Shi, and that sucks. But, you know, you can just purge it, and you already want to be finding stuff that applies fatigue if possible, right? You only need fatigue to be on 1 enemy, so even just something like Purify Aura into Manifest, which wouldn't be so useful for enabling a card like Calm, works perfectly fine with Persist. It is a good card. Especially now that it's in the Shi starting deck too. I think you'll see more than ever that how easy it is to take advantage of this thing. Next up, we've got Pivot. Pivot is a strange one. I'm going to give it B. This is another blocking ability with a follow-up that applies vulnerable, huh? Just like Chaotic Blur. But it's better than Chaotic Blur because the block and the vulnerable are not exclusive. You can get both. 5 block and 3 delay block, the inverse of a repeating deflection. It's not particularly impressive, but it's okay. Delay block vulnerable 1, also not particularly impressive, but okay. As mentioned with Future Strike, you very much like to be able to apply vulnerable that will last over 2 turns, because that means that whether you stick it on an odd or an even turn, it will guaranteed be in effect when they take their Future Strike damage. And you can upgrade this guy to get it from 1 to 3. So, by the time you've got an upgraded Pivot compared to an upgraded Chaotic Blur, they are applying the same amount of vulnerable. It makes the upgrade on Pivot a bit more impactful. The block numbers don't change, but the fact that you're always getting the block instead of only getting the block sometimes is enough for me to say that that's better. On the Shi deck, you probably don't care about this all that much. I guess you could swap it out for repeating deflection. It kind of doesn't make a difference if you're not actually taking advantage of vulnerable. But even if you just have like a random killing blow or something, then it's probably worth doing. Solid enough card. Next up is Pressure. Pressure is also B tier. It's a expensive Shi applier. The amount of Shi it applies is pretty good. 4 2x for Shi is nice. 4x2 for Future Strike would be bad, but for Shi it's pretty acceptable, of course, because you're getting the natural AoE benefits of Shi. The Fatigue Trigger +1 effect makes the Shi application quite strong and makes it a good stone carrier. You put a purple stone or a blue stone or something in here, and you're going to be quite pleased with the results. Upgrading it 6 Shi 2x, that is quite a lot of Shi. It is a very nice way to mix some Shi into a Future Strike deck, I would say. It's a solid Foresight target. It does quite a few things decently. It's not like the best option for anything, and it's not a card that you necessarily would want to include in your deck long term, unless you've already committed a stone to it. But it is good enough a lot of the time. Next we've got Readied Reprisal. Readied Reprisal is going to be B, I would say. So I mentioned with Clairvoyance that it can be kind of difficult to spend 2 energy on a defensive card that does not immediately give you any defense. So that does still to an extent hold true with Readied Reprisal, right? It's quite a bit more delay block. It's a better ratio, right? 30 for 3 is a lot better than 2 for 10. Instead of Vision, you're getting Echo Wall. Echo Wall is, I mean, they're not really comparable, but, you know, the Echo Wall will almost certainly do at least something, right? If you're playing this, it's because you're getting a lot of damage next turn, which means that the enemy will be taking a lot of damage back into the Echo Wall, right? So it's nice. It's an Expel card, so you can only use it once. You probably would like this thing to stick around if you could, so that I would say, excuse me, I would say that's a downside. But what's really, really nice about Readied Reprisal is the upgrade. Purge block 5. That's a really nice effect. That is definitely the best part of Ready Reprisal, I would say, is the ability to just keep purging it when you don't need it. And then, you know, eventually maybe you do actually need to play it, and you'll be pretty happy you have such a efficient blocking option. And on occasion, you will draw it when you don't need delay block and you don't need immediate block, but that's not like a super common occurrence. It's a pretty reasonable card to put in, give an early upgrade point to, and just kind of have it hang around. Not bad at all. Next, we have Repeating Deflection, and Repeating Deflection sucks. C tier card. This is the worst basic block card, like across all classes. This is one of the worst block cards in the game. This is just... it's bad. It's really bad, right? How often have you found yourself staring down a bunch of damage on the stack as you just sadly play Repeating Deflections for their 3 block, knowing that all of that delay block is going to waste because you're not taking damage next turn, right? The fact that you have to plan ahead and that you're not able to react to things like what intent the enemy chooses or what your hand is that you draw next turn, right? You have to make educated guesses by looking at the draw pile. You know, throw this out for no immediate block sometimes because there's no damage on the stack just to try and get delay block. It's really clunky. It's really awkward. Replace these things as quickly as you can. You know, almost every 1-cost block is going to be an improvement over Repeating Deflection. You usually do want to have at least some delay block with Enlightened, so, you know, I wouldn't say swap out all of your Repeating Deflections for immediate blockers, but be aggressive when it comes to cutting Repeating Deflection. Next is Replay. Replay is one of the very limited set of cards with the Rewind keyword. For 2 energy, you get to rewind a target, which reverts their intention to whatever they did last turn, and it applies 2 slow, and then it expels. So let's talk about Rewind in general. How good is Rewind? How useful is Rewind? Not very, if we're being honest. So first off, the biggest complaint that I always hear from people who are not experienced in the game is when you hover the replay over an enemy, it'll give you the single word name that their attack had. Oh, I didn't, yeah, well, it's a B tier, by the way. Let's put that up before I start rambling more. So it'll say, like, enrage, right? Or attack, right? And most people can figure out what attack means, but for the more complicated actions, a lot of people don't know. And if you don't remember, always remember that you can just press tab to pull up the combat log, and it'll tell you what the enemy did. So bear that in mind if that has been weighing into your evaluation of this card or any other rewind effects. So obviously the most important thing to note is that if an enemy chooses the same action twice in a row, rewind does literally nothing, and that's very bad. The other thing to note is that even if the enemy is changing their intention, what they did last time might be more difficult for you to deal with. So it's actually quite tricky to get value out of Rewind. You have to be very timely. You might need to hold it from turn to turn, or you might just need to hope you get lucky. This does have an upgrade, Purge Delay Block 4. That makes it better in the situations where you don't want to rewind. Of course, you just purge it and you're at least getting some value, but you might not necessarily need that delay block. So that's a lot of bad stuff to say about Replay. Why is it still getting a B tier? Well, that's because in the situations where it's good, it can really shine. There are a handful of very specific use cases for rewinding effects that make them quite powerful. So they're really good versus early elites. You can make Bruce try to summon more fish after he's already summoned them, so that's good. Or, alternatively, you can make him attack again to skip the fish summoning if, for whatever reason, you don't want to have to handle fish. It's great on Corpsebound because you can make him just give you dazes instead of attacking, and that's almost always going to be a good idea because he hits so hard. Versus the Skeletal Mage. If he, like, purges debuffs, you can make him waste another turn purging debuffs. If he's doing the Confuse and Attack for 1, that's kind of just like a free turn a lot of the time, because you might not be accomplishing much in terms of dealing damage, but he's not scaling, and the fatigue is going to be applying to him more rapidly at that point, so that's really good. You can, of course, use it versus the Void after you've killed the Void's minions,
so that it wastes another turn trying to buff its now non-existent minions. If the counter runs out, I guess, and he starts doing the buff and attack thing on the first turn there, you can revert him to just one of the less dangerous attacks. Yeah, some of the Vault Guardians you can do some tricky stuff against, right? So maybe you could make the Death Knight do another reshuffle of your deck or whatever. There are some pretty powerful use cases for this thing. So, is it something that you usually want to put into your deck? No, but this is a good card to tech in for elite fights. It's a good card to tech in for boss fights. What's nice too, of course, is that even if you're playing with Blind Spot on, you'll always know when you're going into one of those fights, because the elites are marked on the map, and by floor 3, Blind Spot no longer applies. So all of that is enough for me to give Replay a B. Although I know I kind of was mostly talking about just Rewind in general. Rewind is so hard to access that the goodness of Rewind is almost directly tied to the goodness of the effects that apply it. There's like literally 2 or maybe 3. And the Purge effect does help on this one, of course, with the situationalness. Anyway, next we've got Ritual. Ritual is a B tier card. It's a respectable amount of Shi. 7 for 1 is pretty solid, although the scaling is terrible, of course. Sifting 1, just unconditionally, that's not too bad. Enlightened doesn't have a lot of sift. This is a reasonable way to get some. But the what happens when you sift a card? If it was an affliction, expel it and put a chant in the deck. That's a great effect. That's actually really nice. This is a phenomenal way to manage your afflictions, getting rid of them completely for the rest of the fight, and getting a chant. Chant is usually going to be a good thing to put into your deck. You can see there it's 0 energy, block 3, chain 1, desync, and volatile. If you don't know how chain and desync interact, basically it means that the chant will increment whatever your current chain is. Even though it's an ability, it doesn't disrupt chains that are attacks or buffs. So it's an energy saving card. It's a smidgen of block, the chant itself is, right? Pretty decent to have. Certainly much better to have than an affliction. The upgrade on the Ritual gets you up to 11 Shi, which is, again, pretty decent, even if the scaling's bad. I really like bringing this in versus Void to get rid of the permanent afflictions that you can't even play. Like, you can play the Voids from Daughter, for example, right? But something like Penitence from the Evil Tempest. This is a great way to just get rid of it. It's great if you have afflictions in your deck from Dark Deal or Starting Voids or anything like that. Really, just any time that you know you're going to have afflictions, this is a fantastic card to slam in. If you don't know that you're going to have afflictions, then it's just okay. Again, random sifting is always like at least kind of decent. You know, if you're just playing this for Shi, and then it's, oh, by the way, you can very slightly alter your upcoming draws, that's fine. It's not super valuable, but it's fine. Just, you know, probably don't bother putting this in if you don't have afflictions in mind. But when you do have those afflictions in mind, it's really, really good. Alright, next we have Squid Stance. Squid Stance is an A tier card. I love Squid Stance. So all of the good stuff I said about Centipede Stance, remember, all applies here. It's a non-expelling buff, so it's great with Cultist Ward. It's great with the artifact that puts you Zen when you play a single buff. It's something that you can just slap a Blackstone in and use for the purposes of buff chains. It upgrades to have Rigged to make that easier. So, you know, doing this alongside like a no Condo or something is really good. All of that stuff, all of the incidental things that just relate to the fact that it's a one-cost non-expelling buff, all very good. The difference between Centipede Stance and Squid Stance, of course, though, is that the text on Squid Stance is really, really powerful. This is an effect that I think is going to be pretty easy to underestimate if you have not played with it yourself, or if you haven't seen any of the videos on the channel where I've used this. I've got more than a couple runs that you can check out where the Squid Stance was the win condition. This one single common card can be your entire game plan. It's generally very difficult to drag fights out because almost every enemy buffs their damage output in some form or another, right? Like, or they're boosting their attack power, or they're applying a bunch of poison, or they're filling up your deck with garbage cards or something, right? The enemies almost always have inevitability on their side. If the fight keeps going forever and ever, you will lose. Squid Stance is one of very few cards that changes the math on that. With Squid Stance versus enemies that are buffing up their attack power, you can outpace them. You can play this card enough times that you will be generating hundreds of delay block every turn, and that's just insane, right? Like, there's almost nothing else in the game like it. The fact that you can put a Blackstone in it, the fact that it's rigged, the fact that it becomes free when you're in Zen, the fact that Enlightened has access to vision to recycle it, it is just a really, really crazy effect. Being able to stack up, like, you know, it doesn't take much effort. For example, if you have the vision starting spell, you put a Blackstone on your Squid Stance, you upgrade it so it's rigged. Turn 1, you play it twice. Then you vision it back on top. Turn 2, you play it twice. You now have 4 stacks of Squid Stance. Any random 1-cost ability you play is giving you 4 delay block. And it's free to play that during Zen, because this counts the base cost, not the current cost. You throw in just generic good abilities, stuff like Concentrate, stuff like Stoicism, what have you. Suddenly, not only are they doing whatever they did naturally that made them strong, but they're providing you with a lot of delay block. Rebound cards become crazy. Blackstone abilities become crazy. Even the expensive abilities, even though you can't play as many of them, they get to multiply the effects of your Squid Stance. You play a 2 or 3 cost ability, and you're gaining huge amounts of delay block, and it only goes up. Each time you shuffle the deck, each time you get back to your vision cards and the Squid Stance itself, of course, things like spell coming off cooldown, you get to stack it further and further. You can stack up like 10, 20, or even more copies of Squid Stance. You can have you can get multiple Squid Stances in the deck without too much effort. It's a common card, right? Like, you can go so ham with the Squid Stance and just become invincible. It's a really fun way to play the game if you haven't done it, and it turns out it's really strong too. Even if you don't go all in on it, just getting 1, 2, or, you know, copies of Squid Stance down is actually still pretty impactful. Just adding 2 or 4 delay block to all of your abilities at 1 or 2 cost is really good. So don't underestimate this thing. Alright, next up we've got Stability, another starter card, and this one is also A tier. It is so powerful to enter Zen with stabilities. You only need stability plus 1 other attack. You just get the opener effect, you get the ghost, and you can go Zen just like that. They're really good to put stones in because of the ghosting effect, right? Yellow stone on this thing is 8 block. Purple stone is double overcharge. That's really good. You can do all kinds of wacky stuff with this thing, really. Even you can put a black stone in it, and then for 1 singular card, that's 3 attacks that puts you Zen right there. I wouldn't really recommend doing that, but you can. It's just so flexible in its use cases. You can discard the ghosted copy for value that way. You can really take advantage of this. The upgrade on it is like okay. 3-she 2 times instead of 3-she once is decent. It makes the scaling quite a bit better, besides doubling the immediate output, even if that immediate output is still pretty low. Very often, the stabilities are going to stick around in your deck for quite a while, just because of that Zen entrance. Quite strong. The damage does fall off pretty hard, but again, even in the late game, it's not at all bad to keep like 3-ish stabilities in the deck, just for that opener effect. It's that good. Next we've got Stillness. Stillness previously was a starter card, now it no longer is. And I have to say I'm quite happy about that, because I don't like this card. I'm going to give it a C tier. It is a card whose primary effect is just debuffing. That's it. It doesn't deal damage, it doesn't give you block. I mean, you know, weak is sort of like delay block in a way, but not always. If you manage to get to Zen, you're dealing 9-she, which is equivalent to, I don't know, I mean, it's roughly comparable to something like a Ritual. It's not super impressive, it's okay. The Vulnerable is only useful if you're dealing physical damage, and it's only 1 stack of Vulnerable, which is a problem because, like I've been saying, you need multiple turns of vulnerable to ensure it works with Future Strike. The upgrade does not change that number either. It's always 1. Instead, you get an extra turn of weak and some more Shi if you're in Zen, which is a miserably bad upgrade, if you ask me. That's the one thing you would most care about on this thing, is trying to get more vulnerable, and you just can't. 2 turns of weakness for 1 energy is really not a very good deal, so if you're not getting value out of the Vuln, even an upgraded Stillness is not doing much. You really have to be getting value out of everything for this card to seem even remotely usable, and that's pretty hard to do. I would just say don't waste your time on this thing. It's really not worth it. A lot more trouble than it's worth. Next we have Stoicism. Stoicism is going to be, finally, our first S-tier card. Stoicism is insane. 1 energy, Echo Wall 1, draw 1, desync. Upgrade it so it loses desync. That is very important. As I've mentioned, desync is a really bad line of text to have on a card, but it's not the end of the world with Stoicism, because you will play your Stoicism in Zen a lot, and if you're already in Zen, you don't care about desync. But where this card really shines is its ability to put you into Zen. You know, as nice as it is to do a Blackstone Mind Blast to go into Zen, you know what's better? Blackstone Stoicism to go into Zen, because you're getting cards when you play the Stoicism, which is refunding you the cost of the energy spent to play it. And what's more, if you don't have the abilities needed to finish a Zen chain, well, you're pretty likely to draw them within 2 draws from a Blackstone Stoicism, right? So that's really good. It stacks up a lot of Echo Wall, which is damage, right? Like, it's great with all of the Echo Wall synergies. You can have 1 Blackstone Stoicism is like 50% uptime on Echo Wall just by itself. It's really, really good. You duplicate this card, or you pair it with a no Condo or something, and you've probably got permanent Echo Wall uptime at this point, or massive stacks to dump into a reverb or what have you. Really, really handy. Pretty much every deck I've ever played with Enlightened would have wanted to do that. It's a great use of your Blackstone. I know they're competitive, but this is one of the best options. So, yeah, I mean, that's S-tier material, right? It pretty much is an auto-include, if you ask me. The one exception is if you get this, like, really late in a run, like a common draft in a Well of Stars or from a pack or something, and you can't upgrade it and you can't stone it, then maybe it's not so good. But again, even then, if you can go Zen and play it, it's basically the same as if it's upgraded. If you use something like a Better Future, you can upgrade it. It's a strong card. It's a really strong card. Next we've got Strength of Mind. Strength of Mind is going to be a B tier card. This is a buff that actually does expel, 2 cost. When entering Zen, 25% rage, and if you upgrade it, it goes up to 3 cost, but it gives you 50% rage entering Zen. So the story with this card is just, how do I get it into play, right? It's so expensive. 2 or even 3 cost for a buff is a big ask, and it doesn't have any immediate effect, of course, when you play it, unless you're somehow going Zen immediately off of the Strength of Mind. Good luck with that. Possible, but not particularly likely. Really, you just want to be foresighting this card so that you can throw it out. Being able to have 25% rage every time you enter Zen is quite good. It will actually be a lot of damage over the course of just even a decently long fight, and Enlightened can drag things out a little bit sometimes. You know, if he has to wait around for fatigue in order to deal enough damage to kill stuff, right? It's not out of the question for a fight to go 6 turns. Waiting for the next Future Strike trigger or something, right? So, in those cases, the damage from Strength of Mind is pretty solid, but you really do just want to upgrade it and put some foresight on it. Alternatively, you can just do like Greenstone and just dedicate your first turn to playing this. That's like okay. It goes nicely with some of the more expensive damage dealing cards. It's really good with like 1,000 Fists, for example. It's certainly got its uses. It's a little clunky though, so it doesn't get any higher than B. Next up is Swift Kick. We're not going to spend hardly any time on this one. It's literally just Mind Blast, but it's Future Strike instead of Shi, right? You're probably going to get a little more value out of the damage of this. 5 Future Strike 1 time is really good for scaling because, you know, 5 times 2, 5 times 3, so on and so forth. That's nice. But that's not what you really care about. You just want to upgrade it, put a Blackstone in it to go Zen. Literally everything I said about Mind Blast carries over here, so B tier, just like Mind Blast. Next, we've got Timeless. Timeless is a pretty powerful card. I'm going to give it A. It's got 2 different use cases, kind of 3 if you think about the upgrade. You can play it for 0 to make your Future Strike into She instead, which is a good deal because She has that built-in AoE effect. So 1-for-1 trading Future Strike for She is a good trade. If you don't want to do that, you can purge it for 25% rage. That's a really nice line of text. Just free rage for purging a card. You were probably going to purge at least 1 card this turn anyway, right? Very, very handy. Or, where it really shines, upgrade it to Future Strike additionally becomes She. It might seem a little crazy to watch a card go from 0 cost to 2, because that's, you know, a huge increase in what it's asking you to do, but it's well worth it, because the effect is effectively dealing double damage now. Instead of turning your Future Strike into She, you get your Future Strike, and then you get your She. That is so strong. You really do kind of need to have foresight to make this thing work, because it's very hard to spend 2 energy on an ability and then still be able to go Zen or have enough energy left over to play those attacks that you want to, you know, be getting the She value out of. So that kind of is a little caveat for this. It does need some foresight to really make the most of it. But the great thing about it is that it's always got that purge effect, right? The absolute worst case scenario for Timeless is still pretty dang good, right? If it was literally just purge rage 25%, that would, like, actually still be kind of okay. But it's a whole lot more than that. You can win games off the back of a Timeless, right? It's not going to do it on its own. It needs support from a lot of other cards. Obviously, you need Foresight. Obviously, you need the Future Strike dealing cards themselves. But it does not take very much to make the Timeless pop off. So, gets an A tier. And I guess we can just leave it up because the its brother here, Timely Maneuver, also very good. Timely Maneuver is basically just repeating deflection if it didn't suck. It's a lot more immediate block, only 1 less delay block. The delay block is a follow-up, but that's not very difficult to make happen at all. The upgrade on this thing is really good too. 8 immediate block, 6 delay block, quite nice. I like Timely Maneuver a lot. It is almost always better than repeating deflection, and that is enough to make it a B tier on its own. And it's not very difficult to make it better than other comparable block cards too, right? Cohesion, another 1-cost common block, was block 7, and on occasion you get back 1 energy. It's much more likely that your Timely Maneuver is going to be getting more value than that, right? Because to get the Cohesion energy, you have to be in Zen in the first place, right? Well, if you're in Zen, that means your follow-up is guaranteed, so you're just getting 4 delay block always. Plus the 1 delay, the 1 real block that you're getting more than Cohesion, 8 versus 7. It's just a really solid blocker. Next we have Trance, almost done with the commons here. Trance is a funky one. I'm going to put it in B. It's got a variety of conditional effects here, but they all do the same thing. It's just She, follow up, more She, Zen, even more She. This scales pretty well with Fatigue because you're increasing each of the numbers by 1. The upgrade similarly also increases 2 of the numbers by 2, the conditional ones, but that's still a pretty reasonable upgrade. Plus 4 She, not too bad. It's not the most difficult thing in the world to get all of the effects of this thing. Even if you're only getting the base effect and the follow-up, though, you know, that's pretty decent. Worth noting, too, of course, if you're getting the Zen effect, that always means you're getting the follow-up effect as well, because cards always count as having follow-up while you're in Zen. So, yeah, just a pretty respectable She dealer. It's not the most interesting card, but it's not the worst card either. We can just leave the B up here for the next card. Unbalance, and I can't get the Unbalanced Fury to go away. Darn. Unbalance is 5 Future Strike 1 time. It's a good scaling amount. I've said that plenty of times already. Follow-up apply week 1 is a pretty decent effect. It's not the most impactful, but it's not that bad. It's relatively easy to be in a situation where that does something, even if it's not super impactful. And the upgrade on the 7 Future Strike 1 time. 7 is a very large number to have on a 1-cost attack for the Future Strike. Scales very favorably. It is a very decent sort of just filler attack card. And what's next? Next we have Undermine. Undermine, I guess will also be B tier. Undermine is quite similar to Unbalance in that it's just a big single hit of Future Strike. It's +1 on this guy, and it upgrades to 9. 9 Future Strike 1 time is a lot of Future Strike 1 time. And it gives you Vulnerable, too. 2 stacks of Vulnerable pairs very nicely with Future Strike, right? So it's got some self-synergy going on there. The fact that its opener does kind of suck because it's pretty easy to miss that effect or to have a different opener that's just better. The upgrade does not change the amount of Vulnerable, so if you have Adaptation, then that's a problem too. But nevertheless, it's still a solid scaling card. It is still access to Vulnerable. You know, at least 50% of the time, you will still just be able to get the value out of the Vulnerable. So it's, you know, it's worth something. It's not terrible. And even if you do have Adaptation, you know, the first hit of Future Strike, this always works with. So there is that. Next, we've got Wait For It. Wait For It. I'm going to give a B tier as well. This card occupies a very similar space in my mind to Master of None. It's this 2-cost ability that doesn't do anything immediately, right? It does not deal damage. It does not reduce the damage on the stack. It's just about setup. The Echo Wall kind of is damaged, just delayed, of course. The delay block obviously is block, it's just delayed. The Foresight is energy, it's just delayed. So you really do just need to wait to get your value out of this card. What you're getting is worth more than 2 energy if you were to get it right now, but you're not getting it right now. So that has to factor into the equation. The upgrade makes it quite a bit better, doubling the amount of delay block you're getting. That's an impressive upgrade. If you're using this primarily just as a Foresighter, it's quite bad. You really do need to be getting value out of that delay block for this thing to feel very good. The Echo Wall is just kind of randomly added in there. It's never really what you're going to be considering primarily when you're using this card. It's just a nice bonus. Yeah, it's all right. It's all right to use Foresight on this card, and there is something to be said about cards that give Foresight and are also decent Foresight targets. Lets you dump a lot more Foresight into your deck in general. So that's kind of neat with it, I guess, but it does not rise above B tier. Next, we've got Wave of Focus. Wave of Focus is a solid card. I'm going to give it an A. 5 Shi to all enemies is pretty good. If you're fighting 3 guys, 15 Shi is very strong for 1 energy. That's really good. And if you're not fighting 3 enemies, that means you're probably fighting 1 enemy. And that means that you're getting that solo effect, which means you're getting 10 Shi and potentially doubling a Void Stone in this thing. That's pretty good. It's not ideal versus single targets. You really would rather be doing a little bit more than just 1 mana deal 10 Shi, right? Like, that's not bad, but it's not bringing the house down. So putting a Void Stone in it does make it a lot better in that regard. The upgrade bumps it up to 7. So again, not the most impactful upgrade necessarily, but it is getting multiplied because if there's more enemies, then it's, you know, hitting all of them, so you're getting extra value that way. And if there's 1 enemy, you're getting that extra trigger effect. So the upgrade's a little better than it looks. The scaling on this thing is not that good. If you're getting the double trigger, it's at least scaling a bit in that regard with Fatigue. Really, this card's just kind of an early game sweeper, if you ask me. It's one of the best commons that you can find at the very start of a run. It's great to get this thing out of your card pack. It's great to pick this thing up on like a quick chest right at the start of a run or something. It definitely falls off, though. Nevertheless, I'm quite happy to start most runs with a Wave of Focus and maybe even put my first Void Stone in it. I like Purple Stone in this thing a lot early game. It'll carry you through a lot of hallway fights. Pretty solid card, and it never becomes terrible, right? Even in the late game, it's still pretty alright. Just, you know, double dipping in a Void Stone is never all that bad. And finally, that does it for commons. Let's move on to the uncommons now. We've got Bend Fate. Bend Fate is very powerful. It's an A-tier card, if you ask me. Vision 5 for 1 energy. Basically lets you dictate exactly what your next turn is going to be. And then the Foresight 1 just kind of thrown in there on a bonus. You get to save some energy too. You spent 1 energy to use this effect. You're more than going to get that back with 1 Foresight. It expels, which is definitely a downside. This is a card you would love to be able to reuse. Imagine, you know, using this and then using another vision effect to put this back and just play this every turn. That'd be crazy. If you upgrade it, you get Foresight 2, which is also really good. 1 energy for Foresight 2 is kind of insane. This card's just cracked, man. Fantastic card. Almost always worthwhile. It's at its worst, I guess, when you don't have a full 5 cards to put back. But even then, you know, if you're just getting 3 cards or something, that's still pretty good. I really like it. Next, we've got Body and Mind, if I can type it. Jesus, there we go. Body and Mind. Body and Mind is a B tier card now. It recently was buffed. I would have to give it C tier beforehand because Enlightened really does not like X-cost cards. They do not play nicely with his mechanics. He wants to play 3 different cards of matching types to go Zen. X-costs make that very hard. He wants to benefit from energy discounts in Zen. X-costs don't do that. It's not favorable. The one good interaction with X-cost and the general mechanics of Enlightened is that you can play it for 0 energy and it will still contribute to your chain. So in a Hail Mary kind of scenario, this will, you know, just nudge you over the finish line into Zen, I guess. You really don't want to be in that kind of a circumstance in the first place, though. So that doesn't weigh very favorably, or that does not weigh very heavily into my assessment of this card. Nevertheless, the numbers on this thing are in a position at this stage where I think it's pretty good. 7 Shi and 1 Overcharge X times is actually kind of solid. Getting the upgrade on this thing as well, 10 Shi, that's pretty good. 10 Shi and 1 Overcharge just for 1 energy is like actually kind of good. So if you can play it for 1 in that case, you're feeling pretty good, and usually you can manipulate your energy in such a way that you choose how much energy goes into X costs. The Purge system makes it a lot easier to choose how much energy goes into your X costs, unlike in a game like Spire, for example. So yeah, I would say that Body and Mind is actually pretty nice. I really don't mind playing this for 1. I really don't mind playing it for 2 or 3, just to stack up a bit of Overcharge. Enlightened really likes Overcharge in general, because, you know, very often that extra energy is going to get put to use immediately. He can be a pretty energy-hungry character, so it's good. It's a good card. Next, we have another X-cost card. They're right next to each other. Bring the Thunder. Bring the Thunder is sure strange, right? It's a Tempest card that somehow made its way into the Enlightened card pool. Like, what is this doing here? Rage, 50% X times. That's an enormous amount of rage, but if you're getting an enormous amount of rage, it means you're putting a lot of energy into this thing, and that means you don't have a lot of energy left to be playing your actual attack cards. Far and away, the thing that you care about most with Bring the Thunder is that Purge effect. That's a really good Purge effect. It's a great way to deal with afflictions. It's a great way to hand fix if you're off by 1 for your Zen entry, right? The classic 2 abilities, 2 attacks. If one of those abilities is Bring the Thunder, you just purge it, and odds are you'll be able to fix that problem and have a Zen entry. And, you know, just in general, Purge effects are strong, drawing and discarding is strong. Even if you're not doing anything in specific with it, it's just good to have. If you upgrade this thing, getting X+1 on the Rage is really, really, really good. compared to just having to actually pay for it, because now you can play it for 0, and 0 energy, 50% rage, gain, gain 1 ability chain is actually kind of decent. And even just playing it for 1 at that point for 100% rage and nudging you towards Zen is pretty strong. Nevertheless, I think you will find more often than not that you don't have the upgrade point to spare for this thing, or it's just too awkward to make use of even in the best case scenario. So mostly do just look at that purge effect, and that alone I think really does make it a B tier card, which is kind of strange, but that's just where it's at. I have had runs that kept Bring the Thunder in the deck for the majority of the run and played it 0 times. And I was perfectly happy with that. Alright, next up is Careful Advance. We'll just leave the B up because Careful Advance is also a B tier card. 5 Shi 2 times for 1 energy is not bad. It's pretty solid. The opener effect is also pretty solid. Slow 1 and delay block 5. Yeah, slow 1, obviously you guys know how I feel about the slow at this point in the video, but delay block 5 is pretty solid. That is always going to be, worth something more so than slow. I guess, if the enemy's not attacking you, of course, it's not worth anything, but it's more valuable than slow at all times, is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't need its opener to be decent. If you upgrade it, especially 5 Shi 3 times, that's pretty good damage. It's good scaling. It is an incredibly unremarkable card for the most part, but it's at least a reasonably well-statted unremarkable card. Next we have Cautious Blow. Cautious Blow is also going to be B tier. This is pretty much the counterpart to Careful Advance. 5 Future Strike 2 times instead of the Shi. As I mentioned, Shi versus Future Strike. The Future Strike is worse than Shi because it doesn't have that spreading effect. The only real upside is that it gets the vulnerable, I guess, right? But usually you want the Future Strike numbers to be tuned higher than the Shi numbers. And this having the same amount of damage as Careful Advance, but just in a worse form, is not looking favorable for it. But the opener effect is quite a bit better. Weak always affects the enemy, whereas slow might do literally nothing. Also, immediate block is pretty handy. It's nice to have some sources of immediate block on Enlightened, and this is a reasonable way to get some. The upgrade on this one is also not quite as good in terms of damage. 5 Future Strike 3 times is not as good scaling, because Future Strike scales the opposite way of Shi. So it's just worse damage, but better defensive effect, right, is the comparison between this and Cautious Blow, or Careful Advance. So I'd say it's a side grade, so they retain the same tier status. They're both fine. Next up, we've got Circular Logic. This is one of the craziest cards in the game. Like, it's hard to believe that this card actually managed to make its way in its current form. Maybe a little controversial. I'm going to give this an S tier. This card is kind of insane. It is Vision and Foresight. Earlier I said that can be a little difficult to get them both at the same time when we were talking about Master of None. Well, this is the same package of Vision and Foresight, except it costs 1 less, and it loops itself. It goes back into the deck. You can just keep using it over and over again. What the heck? Why is that allowed? Crazy, crazy ability. Purge Loop is strange. It's hard to say if that's like a particularly good effect or not. I would say generally it's good, because if you draw this at the wrong time and you don't want to make use of it yet, just, put it back in the deck, draw it later. The upgrade on it, also giving you Chain 1 when you purge it, is kind of nutso, though, because purging for Chain is really strong. It's a little bit less good than purging for 1 extra energy, but purging for 1 extra energy is, like, very, very, very strong. So, something that's a little bit worse than that is still pretty good. But a really easy way to win an Enlightened run, if you're having some trouble on lower instability levels at the very least, just get one really massive damage card, ideally like 1,000 Fists, and a Circular Logic. If you manage to put those two cards together, just keep casting Circular Logic on your big expensive damage card, and then keep playing the big expensive damage card, and then you just keep visioning it back and foresighting it, and playing it, and putting it back and playing it. The Circular Logic keeps recycling itself. It's absurd how strong you can make a deck, which is 2 cards. Worth noting, there's one very strange peculiarity of Circular Logic. Vision puts the card on top of your deck, right? Cards resolve from top to bottom in this game. So the Vision happens first, then the Foresight, then the Loop. Loop shuffles into the deck. It's in a random location. So it's always possible that the Loop puts itself on top of the deck, and the next card you draw is not actually what you visioned. So if you go, like, Circular Logic, put something back, and then you try to draw it with, like, a Stoicism, you might just draw Circular Logic again. That's always very frustrating when that happens. Especially, too, because then you could purge it, and then maybe it puts itself right back on top again, right? Pretty funny. But more often than not, that won't happen, of course. It becomes more likely the fewer cards are left in deck, so do keep it in mind. But it's certainly not enough to dethrone this card from being an S-tier card. If you have any card that costs 3, you should probably put Circular Logic in the deck, especially if it's a damage card. And even if you don't with 2-cost damage cards, it can still be really strong. Very, very good card. Next, we've got Convergence. Convergence, one of the new cards, and boy, do I like this one. A tier. Very powerful card. So for 3 energy, 5 Shi 3 times, that's pretty good. I was somewhat favorable about some 2-cost cards that were 5 Shi 2 times. So going up by 1 cost, 5 Shi 3 times, that's pretty good. It's not phenomenal damage, but that's okay, because the rest of this card's effect is bonkers. Choose a foreseen card to put from the deck into the hand. That's really good. It's like draw, but better, assuming that you actually have a foreseen card, that is, right? But if you don't have a foreseen card, guess what? Just get one Foresight now, right? Like, every time it seems like there's going to be something bad about the card, you read the next line of text and you're like, oh, never mind. It's just great, right? Oh, well, the damage isn't that great. Oh, but it gets me a foreseen card. Oh, but what if I don't have a foreseen card? Oh, then it just gives me Foresight. Especially if you upgrade this thing. The damage gets better, of course, but more importantly, you get to foresee 2 if there are no cards in the deck. I said that Calm foreseeing 2 for 2 and doing nothing else was good. Well, foreseeing 2 for 3 while also getting 21 base Shi is ridiculous. That's so good. Yeah, I mean, what else is there to say? This card's nuts. I love it. Super duper strong. Next, we've got Echoes of the Past. This is a very strange card. It's not a card I like very much, but nevertheless, I do have to begrudgingly give it a B tier. It's so expensive to effectively accomplish nothing when you play it, right? It's no block, it's no damage, it doesn't do anything on its own. It just gives you more copies of another card. So the card you're getting copies of, it better be really good. The upgrade on this thing also is pretty bad. It just gives you upgraded copies of the card. Well, the card you're duplicating had better be a good card, which means that if it's a good card, you've probably already upgraded it. So yeah, not a good upgrade for Echoes of the Past. Pretty low value. And its effect is just wholly dependent on what other targets you have. There are some very good ones. So if you do have that upgraded Blackstone Stoicism, Echoes of the Past is looking pretty good. It's good with persists as well if you have Blackstones on that. You know, yeah, there's plenty of good things that you can hit with an Echoes of the Past. Although it's pretty tricky to make use of it if you don't have one of those slam dunk great cards. At the very least, it's nice in that 2 copies of 1 card means that that's your 2 chains towards Zen. So that's kind of good, I guess. You can foresee this to help deal with the fact that it's so expensive for what that's worth. I mean, it lets you do some combos potentially versus like the Void, for example, right? It lets you get extra copies of Expel cards. In theory, you can do some really wacky stuff where you can make like infinite copies of Echoes of the Past, which then lets you make infinite copies of other cards. But, you know, the amount of energy and effort spent doing that, it's probably just like a win more kind of thing at that point, right? Like, yes, you could break the game wide open if you manage to get double Echoes of the Past, but there's probably better things you could be doing with your time and energy. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this one, but I do recognize that it is powerful and it does have potentially strong upsides. So I will give it a B tier, but I don't know. Probably not worth using a lot of the time. Okay, next we have Escalate. And this is such a weird one to tier. You know, this is part of the benefit of not actually putting it on a tier list, is I can kind of just cheat. I'm not going to give Escalate a tier, because it's not really possible to confine this card's use in a way like that, because it basically is 2 tiers at the same time, which is to say that this is a C tier card 99% of the time, because it is just really, really not worth the energy. The amount of Shi that you're getting out of this thing is almost never worth 2 energy, right? Even upgraded, going from 20 Shi per 3 Shi per 20, upgraded going to 15, or 3 Shi for 15. Jesus, if I can talk. That's still not very favorable the vast majority of the time for 2 energy, right? Like, this would be like maybe okay for 1 energy a lot of the time, and even then it would be a bit of a stretch. But specifically, if you are on a very heavy Shi-focused deck versus the Void, this card will single-handedly turn a run that has a 0% chance of winning into a run that handily defeats the Void. So in that case, it would be S tier, right? Because it's just a single card that just immediately turns a losing deck into a winning deck. And not just that, but a deck that wins easily. But that's a very specific scenario to be in. There's a lot of things that we've added into the game to try and help you beat the Void when you're focused on Shi, besides just trying to get Escalate only at this point. But it is still the best at doing what it does, and you might not get those other cards and artifacts and stuff. An upgraded Blackstone Escalate does just chunk the Void, right? Like, that's what it is. It's the thing that hurts the Void a lot. So I cannot comfortably put this in a tier. I think it's a very simple card to understand what you should be doing with it, when you should use it, when you shouldn't. And that's essentially just all that we've laid out here. So make of that information what you will. Moving on, we've got Exhale. Exhale, I guess, is a B tier card, but it's not a very high level B tier card. It's like a B minus. 5 Shi to a random enemy 5 times, 25 total Shi for 2 energy. Seems like a pretty good deal, and it scales well, plus 5 extra Shi every time you get fatigue. The downside of Exhale is twofold. It's random. That's pretty bad. You want to stack your Shi all on one guy, of course. And it is an ability. Shi is affected by Rage, but only attack cards care about Rage. So Shi on an ability does not benefit from Rage. And Rage scaling your Shi is usually a pretty good idea with Enlightened. It's a great way to accelerate your damage output. Exhale just being completely unable to interact with that is very unfortunate, on top of the random targeting. Upgrading it, you get 5 Shi 7 times, which, you know, that's a pretty good upgrade. Plus 10 Shi base, plus better scaling. If it was an attack, I would love this card, but it's not, and that really does hurt it a lot. The fact that it's 2 cost also can be a little bit awkward. You know, decent with Foresight. Yeah, not much to say about that. Somewhat often, I just don't bother with Exhale at all when I get it. But it's not without its uses. Obviously, versus a single target, the fact that the randomness goes away would be nice, but then it's like and she is not particularly good versus single targets, so yeah, a little bit clunky. It's kind of been the name of the game with a lot of these lower ranked Enlightened cards is clunkiness. Next we have Flurry of Blows. Flurry of Blows is a pretty cool card. This one is a higher level B tier, I would say. 2 Future Strike 1 time to a random enemy, 6 times. So wrap your head around that. Purging it also deals 2 Future Strike to a random enemy, which is like decent, I guess. It's not bad. Upgrading it, you get 3 Future Strike to both the normal effect and the purge effect. Again, this is an ability, so it's not affected by rage. That hurts it a lot. But it is a lot of total Future Strike, right? It's got pretty good scaling for what that's worth. Yeah, it's not nearly as powerful as something like an Unbalanced Fury is, just because of that ability status. But it'll do in a pinch, you know. You slap some Foresight on this and throw it out, and it's pretty reasonable. And the Purge effect is cool. So it does get to be B tier. I considered putting it in A tier, but I decided it wasn't quite good enough. Harmony. Harmony was quite good enough. A tier card. I like Harmony a lot. Obviously, 1 energy block for sucks, but 1 energy block for Ghost is really good. So just make sure you're going Zen, and then Harmony suddenly becomes a huge block card. Especially if you upgrade it, it goes up to 6 block per play. That's pretty good. It is a great way to make use of excessive Zen plays. It's a great way to save a little bit of energy that you might have had to use on some block cards otherwise. Pretty good value. It's a good way to exit Zen if you care about that for whatever reason. So like, for example, maybe you want to do a double Zen entry turn. Try and take advantage of your beads or like a Stoic Mask or some sort of Enter Zen power. You can use some cards to go Zen, and then the Harmony on its own will use up all of your Zen plays for, you know, a pretty decent effect. And then you still have all the other cards in hand, plus a ghosted copy of Harmony. You still get that ghosted copy on the last play before you exit Zen. So that's pretty good. And if you go back into Zen, you can keep playing that ghosted copy and it'll continue to ghost. Very cool. A lot of fun tricks you can do with this. You can always discard the ghosted card in hand too, if need be, with like a blue stone or something. I really like it. Next we have Mind Over Matter. Mind Over Matter is really strong. This is an A tier. Put all cards with Foresight from deck to hand. And if you upgrade it, it has Purge Foresight 1. How was this allowed? That's such a strong ability. Purge Foresight 1, ridiculous. And that aside, obviously, putting all cards with Foresight into your hand is crazy. This is generally a very good thing to put a green stone in. You can use it alongside your upgraded clarities. You use it alongside a green stoned calm or something. You know, it's really powerful. You're getting a lot of pure advantage just by putting many cards into your hand for one. It's like, you know, card draw, kind of like Convergence. The fact that those cards are free is really good. The fact that you get to choose in advance which cards you want to be able to whip out with the Mind Over Matter is great. It lets you set up 2-card combos very easily. You just put Foresight on those cards and then play Mind Over Matter. Really, really good. Just note, of course, it does only pull from deck, so bear that in mind. But in general, Mind Over Matter is a really powerful card. If you have almost any Foresight at all, you're going to be pretty happy to have Mind Over Matter. And if you don't have any Foresight, you're probably going to be happy to grab this thing and upgrade it so that you can have Foresight. Powerful card, powerful card. Another pretty powerful card is Mix Up. Mix Up is also going to be A tier. 8 Future Strike 1 time. That is a pretty good scaling form of Future Strike. And if the target has no Future Strike, trigger twice, so it's 8 by 2. That's a lot of Future Strike. Especially if you upgrade it, 11 Future Strike base. And it gets this really cool Purge Trigger Void Stone effect. So Obviously, since it's extra triggers, it's good to put a Void Stone on this thing, but then if the target does have Future Strike, you'd be sad because now you're purging it and you're not getting value from your Void Stone, but that's what the upgrade is for, right? If you're a She-focused deck, Mix-Up can actually be a fantastic way to add a huge amount of damage into your deck. I think you'll be impressed playing this card, seeing just how much the output is if you haven't given it a chance before. The one big problem it has, obviously if you have a Future Strike focused deck, it's not that good. But outside of that, it does still have a problem, which is that you can't just spam it out like crazy in the way that you could something like, say, 1,000 Fists, because it applies Future Strike itself. So, for example, trying to, vision it back and then play it again, if the Future Strike didn't trigger last time because it was an odd turn, your following mix-up is going to be a lot weaker. So that's a bit of an issue. And it can have some weird problems with, like, stuff. So, like, if you have, like, a random clawed chain artifact or something that's throwing out Future Strike randomly, or, any sort of effect like that that might put Future Strike on something that you aren't necessarily wanting, that can be a bit of an issue. But it's a really good early game card, and it's pretty strong in the mid game too. You don't want to be relying on this as your single late game, like, serious beefy damage source, but it will help out a lot versus bosses and elites. So, worthy of A tier. Next we've got Peace of Mind. Peace of Mind is going to be B tier, I would say. A lot of the things that I said about Strength of Mind remain true here. This one costs 3 base, it upgrades to be 2, but nevertheless, you're saying the goal is the same. You mostly want to try to Foresight this thing to get it down. Block instead of Rage when you enter Zen. It's decent to get block when you go Zen, right? Ideally, you're going Zen pretty much every turn, and 6 block every turn is pretty strong. It lets you focus more on doing damage while you're in Zen, which is good, because you want to be aggressive, of course, as much as possible. And Zen is a really powerful tempo option, so being able to focus more of that tempo on damage is good. The upgrade on this one is pretty mid because, like I said, when you're foresighting this card, the upgrade, it doesn't matter. So, not huge on that. Paying 2 for this thing feels quite bad. Paying 3 for it, obviously, is just miserable. But if you have the foresight, it's pretty okay. It's pretty okay. Whoops. Next we have Pinpoint. Pinpoint's an interesting card. I'll give it B tier. Very comparable to Pressure. Pressure was a bunch of She, and if the enemy was fatigued, it triggered again. Pinpoint is a bunch of She, and if the enemy is fatigued, it doesn't trigger again. It gets rebounded, but then it also gives you 1 energy. So you do still have to net pay 1 energy to get the second play down, but then it gives you the energy back again to, like, refund that. So if you play it twice, it's effectively only 2 energy spent. Kind of weird to consider that, but that's how it works basically. The way it works not basically is because it's a rebound instead of an extra trigger, you can choose to double play it, play and purge, or play and hold. So obviously that's a really nice, flexible card. The upgrade on it makes it 13 She. It is a lot of She all at once. And, while I have been pointing out in most cases when the scaling is not good, I will at the least say that for She, you always do have the Jade Mantis to consider, doubling the first application of She. That can make it pretty strong to have a card like Pinpoint that's just 1 big fat stack of She all at once, especially because you could theoretically, hold the Pinpoint turn over turn pretty easily while still getting value from playing it. It's okay. It's okay. It's not knocking my socks off, but I don't hate it. If you foresight this, too, that is also kind of nice, because then it's actually netting you energy. You play it for 0 and you gain 1. That's cool. But, yeah, just okay. Next up, Purify Aura. This is a pretty interesting card. It's one of the 2-part cards. I will give it A tier. Purify Aura, for 2 energy, you get weak 1 and slow 1 to all enemies, which is a terrible deal. But it puts a Manifest in your discard pile. Manifest over here, you can see 0 energy, apply 1 fatigue, expel. Very strong. Manifest is really, really powerful. So you gotta be content playing the inefficient and crappy Purify Aura so that you can get the incredibly awesome Manifest. The upgrade on Purify Aura is fine. Getting an extra 1 stack a week on everybody is cool, I guess. It's pretty slow, I will say, of course, with Purify Aura. If you are just waiting around for the Manifest to get shuffled back into the deck naturally, that's very slow. You really want Vision to get the Manifest immediately. Obviously, the 1 starter deck is going to have the spell that gives you Vision, so that's a great use of your spell, is you rig the Purify Aura with a green stone, and then you just go immediately play it, use the spell to put Manifest out, and just get the Fatigue rolling. Fatigue is super duper powerful, scaling of course, so this is like a great way to make sure that you're killing bosses, elites, the Void, all that kind of stuff. Also, if you manage to get a Manifest upgraded by the use of maybe you're visioning it with a better future or something, it applies fatigue to all enemies, and that's really cool. It does not upgrade itself in any way naturally, right? The Purify Aura doesn't give you an upgraded Manifest, so the better future is a common enough thing, though, that I will say that it's worth looking out for that. Better future on Manifest is really cool. Yeah, good card. I mean, it says apply fatigue, right? Pretty much everything that says apply fatigue is really, really good. There's a little shortcut for you. Next, we've got Pyre. Get that A out of here. Pyre is not an A tier card. It is, in fact, a C tier card. This is another one of the new ones that's focused on afflictions. Each time, the first time each turn you draw an affliction, you discard 1, that's probably the affliction itself. You gain 1 overcharge, you gain 1 energy. So always remember, with cards whose primary purpose is generating you energy, you want to consider the math of how much energy you have to gain for it before it pays for itself. And it doesn't just have a 2 cost associated with it, there's a hidden +1 because you didn't purge it. Every card you purge is +1 energy. So playing a card sort of costs you, playing in this case, Pyre, kind of costs you 3 energy. 2 to actually have played it, 1 because you didn't purge it. So you're down 3 energy. That means that if you draw an affliction, you've gained 1 energy, then like next turn the overcharge kind of gives you back another energy. So if you don't, that's if you don't already have overcharge. If you already have overcharge, this just extends the duration of it. You may or may not even run out of overcharge, so this might not actually do anything. If we're being generous, we can say that if you trigger this twice, it's paid for itself. And from that point onward, you're actually benefiting. So for Pyre to make sense, you have to draw it, play it, and then draw 2 afflictions afterwards, and then draw at least 1 more affliction in order to have really received much of any benefit. I mean, the discard, you can say, is worth something if you're drawing an affliction that gives you a bad effect. If it's in your hand at the end of the turn, you know, then you're dodging that, and that's worth something. But there's a lot of afflictions that don't do that, you know, voids, dazes, banes, all that jazz. And in that case, the discard is not particularly helpful. I guess it's helpful versus, like, the Puppet Master, or versus the what's it called, the Taxidermist. You know, like, it's got some value in that department. But realistically, like, again, right, you shouldn't have afflictions in your deck if you can help it, and if you do, you should be getting rid of them rather than putting this uncommon card into your deck. So the situations where it's useful are pretty small. You really only would just want to tack it in against a handful of fights. Specifically versus the Void, it's pretty decent. And I guess, you know, versus some of those other guys that I mentioned, like Puppet Master, you know, it's pretty decent. But by and large, you don't really want this card, and there's other cards that do its job a lot better. You know, we already talked about Ritual. Ritual, I would say, is probably better than Pyre. Something like if you could get an enough Suffering, I know that's a rare, but it's just so much better than Pyre. Yeah, we don't really like Pyre. Next, we got another buff. Reach Through Time. Reach Through Time is a B tier card, I would say. Ever since it got buffed to be a 1-cost card, it's pretty decent. It's a very weird effect to use. Vision for attacks on odd turns and vision for abilities on even turns. So vision, of course, is normally supposed to be something that like boosts your consistency. It lets you use the same cards over and over again. It helps make sure that you're able to flex your most powerful cards and not be dragged down by your least powerful cards as much. But since Reach Through Time is itself inherently unreliable, it doesn't provide the same sort of consistency that you normally would want with vision. It ends up being very similar to what I've been saying, where like a random sift to slightly change the math on what you're likely to draw is decent. It's kind of like that, but in reverse. Instead of taking a card out of the draw pile, you're putting a card into the draw pile. And there's a decent chance that it's not a card that you're super enthused about putting back in the draw pile, but it'll at least be okay to say, like, hey, you know, I'll at least give myself the chance to draw this slightly better block card or something, right? I mean, obviously, in this case, it's not the chance you're guaranteeing because it's going on top, but, you know, that's counterbalanced by the fact that sometimes this will actually just be a downside if you are just trying to draw through your deck to get to your best card, and you haven't found it yet, right? Normally you want to be visioning your best card, but this is mandatory vision, so if you get the Reach Through Time in play before you get to that, you know, 1,000 Fists or whatever, you're actually going to be slower getting there. So you can kind of remedy that by having draw cards, so, you know, you could be visioning back a Stoicism or a Battle Plan or something. You could be visioning back a Combination Strike or a Persist to get more draw that way. You know, it's a little bit weird. You can do math about, like, oh, how many attacks versus abilities am I likely to draw to try and make your Zen entries easier. It's got some ways to flex it. Sick artwork, by the way. It's a top-tier artwork, I'll give it that. But overall, it's just alright. Nothing to write home about. Okay, next we've got Reconciliation, and I sadly have to put this one in the C tier. I do not like Reconciliation very much. It's an expensive effect that does very little most of the time. Pretty much any time you can target your Shi, you want to put it all on one guy until they die. So this only really does anything if you have randomly targeted Shi, or AoE Shi. And there are, you know, a number of ways to do that. The spell on Marshall is AoE Shi. A card that I was very positive on, Wave of Focus, is AoE Shi. Like, Exhale can randomly spread its Shi around, stuff like that. But, you know, spending 2 energy on a whole nother card just to try and, like, make up for the failings of your other cards is not usually what you want to do. You don't want to use cards to make your other cards less bad, right? Like, you want them to be doing good stuff, and then this makes them more good. So yeah, I'm not too keen on Reconciliation for that reason. The Slay effect is kind of nifty, you know, but a lot of times when an enemy dies off of Shi, you're pretty close to killing everybody else already anyway. So it's not as big a benefit as it might seem, right? Like, the downside that you have to suffer for using this card is cutting into some of that benefit anyway. If you upgrade it, Purge, deal 2 Shi to all enemies, that's like okay. That's fine, I guess. It's hard for me to be very positive about this card. I've found very few decks where it was optimal to put in a Reconciliation. Almost none, in fact. Next up, we have Reflect. Remember when I said earlier that Purging for Chain was like really good because it was a lesser version of Purging for Energy, and Purging for Energy is crazy good? Guess what this card does? It purges for energy. So Reflect is an S tier card, literally just because it says Purge, gain 1 energy on upgrade. I know that's not even a part of the base effect. I know I haven't even talked about the base effect, but even more so than Bring the Thunder, this is a card that really just 99% of the time cares about that upgraded Purge effect, right? Like, this line of text is what Reflect should be in your mind most of the time, because this is so intensely powerful, especially for Enlightened. But, of course, the actual effect for playing it is really nothing to sneeze at either. 1 energy Echo Wall, 1 Chain 1. You just need to play one other ability and then you're Zen, so that's decent. So it's kind of saving you energy in that regard as well. But it really is just hard to overstate how powerful Purge Gain 1 energy is. There's almost nothing else in the entire game at this point that can effectively be compared to Purge Gain 1 energy. And there used to be more stuff like that, but it had to get removed or nerfed because it was too good. This is pretty much the only one that's left. Seems like people are sleeping on it, if you ask me, because the statistics for this card are not what I think they should be. When we were doing our balance passes and we looked at the statistics for the win rates of this card, I feel like they should be higher. I use this thing pretty much every time I find it, and it's amazing pretty much every time I find it. Again, right, the only real reason that you'd be sad is if you can't upgrade it because you get it from a card pack in the second Well of Stars or something. And even then, it's not terrible. Okay, next up we have Run Ragged. And this is a card that applies fatigue, so therefore it is at minimum A tier. That's all there is to it. It's very expensive, but its default is 1 fatigue to everyone, so that's nice. You don't have to jump through hoops with like vision or upgrades or anything like you did with the Manifest. It's also got this, you know, incidental but interesting Future Strike application effect. The upgrade on this one is pretty bad. All it does is remove the conditional aspect of the Future Strike application. So if you are just hitting everybody for 5 damage only with this, that's not very good, but it's at least something. I'm more than happy to slap a greenstone in this and just spend my first turn playing a Run Ragged. If you don't have a greenstone, obviously try to foresight it or something, but it is just generally pretty good. I like it. I like it. Next we have Set in Stone. Foresight 1 for 1 energy if the card's unstoned at a yellow stone, and if you purge it, sift 1. Upgraded, you get to do 2. This is a B tier card, I would say. So 1 energy Foresight 1 is good for clarity. It's not quite as good for Set in Stone, I would say, though, because it doesn't have that upgrade to Rig, which is a really big part of why clarity is good. Putting a Yellowstone into a card is pretty handy. That's not bad at all. Purging to Sift 1 can be handy. It's not bad. You know, again, purge effects, random sifts like that. It's just good value. Upgrading this thing 2 for 2 is good. That compares favorably against Calm because it's got this extra beneficial effect. And it's got the Purge as well. I don't hate putting Greenstone in this thing and upgrading it. It's okay. It just gets the job done in terms of Foresight. That's all I can say. Next we have Smack to the Future, another Rewind card. This one, though, I am actually going to give A tier. So we kind of already talked about Rewind, how it works, why it's good, why it's bad. And all of that comes to Smack to the Future. Smack to the Future notably does not have a Purge effect, even on upgrade, like Replay did, which was a decent part of why I said Replay was a pretty alright card. But what Smack to the Future does have going for it is that it just deals a whole crap ton of damage, right? Even if you don't care about the Rewind effect, this is a pretty good card. 5 Future Strike 5 times for 2 energy is strong. And if you upgrade it, it's 6 Future Strike 5 times for 1 energy. That is ridiculous. That is the best ratio of Future Strike to energy that you were going to get on almost any card. So this just becomes a single-use damage nuke. And then also it rewinds, by the way. Which, you know, maybe it's good. I don't know. it's probably at least okay. But if not, then that's fine. You're still just hitting something very, very hard. So, very good. A tier. Next, we have Spirit Essence. Spirit Essence, I'm also going to put in A tier. 1 energy for 9 Shi is decent. It's pretty good. Zen, if you have 0 energy, gain 1. Same effect as Cohesion. Again, that's an effect that's not the easiest to take advantage of, but it will happen sometimes, and that makes it okay. But what's really nice about this card is if you upgrade it, 13 Shi for 1. That's pretty good. And also Chain 1. Very strong. Makes it a lot easier to go Zen. Pretty valuable effect. Yeah, just makes it an all-around nice card for energy economy. Going Zen faster means you save energy. Being able to use it to gain 1 energy while in Zen is good. It's just a good card. Spirit Walk, on the other hand, is not quite as good. We're going to have to give this one B. 2 energy for 11 She is not great, but it has Ghost, but it has Desync, and it has Inert. If you upgrade it, it loses Desync and Inert, and it goes up to 13 She, so you can just play it over and over again. You can trigger your Void Stone over and over again. It lets you go Zen with it, but that's not super strong. So obviously a 1-card Zen entry is good, and this can do that. You can just keep playing it after you've upgraded it, and it'll go Zen eventually if you have the energy to spend. But it is a very energy-hungry card. You'd have to spend 6 energy on this thing to go Zen with it alone, so that's a big ask. What is probably better is to go Zen and then play the Spirit Walk a bunch while you're already in Zen. Putting a Void Stone in this thing, you know, you can get some value out of it, but you really do struggle to play this thing more than like 3 or so times per turn. So the dreams you might have when you see this thing of getting like 5 overcharge or, you know, applying just enormous amounts of She, they often won't come into fruition, but it's still okay, even if you're not able to go completely crazy with it as you might want. Next up is State of Mind. State of Mind is also B tier. This one is another non-expelling buff, and it's got some interesting stuff going on. When you enter Zen, deal 4 She to all enemies. That's kind of hard to make work. You can stack it up a couple times and it starts to get respectable. It's not a very great source of damage, but it is a source of damage. I had a run not too long ago where this was the only card that managed to bail me out of an otherwise grisly end to the Act 1 boss. So, you know, I mean, like, it is a 1-card solution to damage, sort of. The upgrade on this thing is very strange, though. It's Purge deal 4 She to all enemies, so twice as much She on the Purge there as you could get on the Purge for Reconciliation. So that's interesting, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it really is, like, not what you want. But you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need, and State of Mind can be what you need. So we'll give it a B tier. Next up we have Then Again. And Then Again is just a very simple, rather uninteresting good block card. 1 for 5 is bad, 1 for 10 is good. So just use it as a follow-up, and it'll be a good block card. If you upgrade it, Zend for delay block, that's kind of nifty. The fact that you can double trigger Void Stones on it is kind of nifty, but, you know, there's really very little of interest to do with this thing. It's just blocking. So, B tier. Next, we're into the rares now. We have Time Warp, or, oh no, we're not in the rares yet. We're almost into the rares. Time Warp is a pretty fascinating card. I'm gonna give it B tier. It's a pretty high B tier, though. It causes Future Sight to trigger at the end of this turn, and it applies Vulnerable 2 to all enemies. Upgrades to have Purge Chain 1. Purge Chain 1 pretty strong, as I mentioned. But even without the upgrade, just looking at the base effect. So when you play this, there's 2 situations that you can be in. You're either already on a Future Strike turn, in which case this first line of text does nothing. But then, you know, you're getting Vulnerable 2 right before Future Strike triggers. That's really good. Even with adaptation, that's, you know, that's value. Or it's not a Future Strike turn, in which case the Future Strike triggers now, and you get that vulnerable anyway, right? The vulnerable's always relevant. So how valuable is it to have Future Strike trigger now instead of next turn? It's not actually extremely valuable, believe it or not. Because, you know, that Future Strike was going to trigger eventually. Once you've played a card that applies Future Strike, you're getting the damage at some point. The only time it really matters that the Future Strike happens now instead of later is when it's killing something. If it's killing something and ending a fight, you're potentially avoiding taking damage or needing to block. If it's killing an enemy but not ending the fight, then you're at the very least not having to worry about whatever action they take. So, you know, that's something, but mostly I would look at this card as a side grade to Natural 20. Natural 20, the neutral card that's just 1 energy, apply 2 vulnerable to everyone. This is kind of a side grade to that. It's better specifically for Enlightened being able to make sure that that Future Strike happens on the vulnerable turn, because 2 vulnerable with Natural 20 doesn't guarantee that it's going to stick around for Future Strike if you have Adaptation, or if there's an enemy that cleanses debuffs. Of course, Natural 20 can upgrade to be 4, which does guarantee that, whereas Time Warp instead upgrades for Purge Chain 1. Completely different upgrade. Pretty powerful, though. And I will at least say one more thing in its favor. Versus the Void, who drops off the debuffs extra fast, making sure that you have the vulnerable go on the turn the Future Strike triggers is actually an upside over even getting 4 vulnerable with Natural 20. So that's how I like to look at Time Warp. I think it's pretty solid. Next we have Tranquilize. Tranquilize is probably also a B tier card. This one's a little tough to give a general score to. Unlike Congeal or Amplify on Tempest, this debuff naturally lasts 2 turns, which is really good. The downside, of course, is that you have to pay energy for this thing. It's not free. But the reason that it lasts 2 turns is so that you can make use of all of the delay block that you're going to be generating potentially. And that's quite good, because you can make a whole lot of delay block that goes to waste. So being able to turn that into She on the target is really, really nice. The upgrade on this one just loses Expel. If you have like a Squid Stance or something, this is probably crazy. You can use it with stuff like Ready to Reprisal. You can use it with those relics like the Echo Cloak and things. All that jazz. It's a pretty decent card, I think. Next we have Unbalanced Fury. Not Unbalance. And I've referenced this one a few times already, so that should probably be a pretty good sign that it's quite strong. I give it an A tier. This is some grade A primo Foresight fodder right here. You throw Foresight on this thing, you throw it out, it deals a whole crap ton of Future Strike, it hits everybody. It is very good. This can be your go-to damage solution for pretty much an entire run. It doesn't even really need an upgrade if you're doing that with it, because the upgrade gives it Chain 1. If it's being foreseen, then odds are it doesn't really need to factor into your Zen entry, because being free, you can just mix it into whatever you want. But the upgrade is still decent anyway, especially if you want to actually be paying energy for this thing. Yeah, I mean, what else is there to say? It's just a big, huge AoE damage card. It's good. And now, finally, the last uncommon, Union. Union is a card that I liked a lot when I was new to the game, and my opinion on it has soured a bit over time, but it's still not bad. It's still at least a B tier. 3 Future Strike 4 times and 8 She, so the whole gimmick of this thing, right, is a little bit of both. You get some Future Strike, you get some She, but they're both applied in the, quote, wrong way for how you would want them to be for scaling. You want large single instances of Future Strike and small multiple instances of She. It's flip-flopped here, which is, you know, awkward. But in terms of how much damage you're actually getting total out of this thing, it's still pretty decent. Being a little bit of both, it doesn't fit well into either strategy, so, you know, it only gets some value out of something like Vulnerable. It doesn't play as well into the AoE stuff that She does naturally. At the very least, Rage works pretty well with this, because they both benefit from Rage. The upgrade just, you know, further increases the non-scaling parts, so more times in the Future Strike, larger instance of She. It's okay. This is a very takeable mid-game damage dealer that falls off later on, and I would say that at least makes it worth a B. Now, actually moving on into the rares. First up, we've got Back in Time, and Back in Time, sadly, I have to give a C. It's not good. 2-cost buff. This is applying slow to an enemy, will also deal 8 Shi, and it expels. If you upgrade it, it deals 11 Shi. I've been ragging on slow for quite a while now, so it should not surprise you to hear me say that you probably shouldn't have a lot of slow application in your deck. And if you don't have a lot of slow application in your deck, Back in Time does not do very much. More or less the only thing that's like good to use with Back in Time is Lash and Kick. What's nice about the Lash and Kicks is that you'll have a lot of them and that they can do stuff without, you know, interacting with the slow thing. Then, you know, you throw the Back in Time out, you go Zen, you play a couple Lash and Kicks, you're dealing a lot of Shi, it's really good. But, you know, that's not always the something you'll have the chance to do. If you're on the other starter deck, you don't have Lash and Kicks. You might not be able to go Zen easily on a turn when you have Lash and Kicks. The real problem with this card is just that there's not enough good ways to enable it, because its effect is on paper very, very strong. You know, if there were more good cards that happened to deal with slow or, you know, relics or other such things, then I'd be a lot happier with Back in Time. The dream is that you get blindfold when you're on Lash and Kicks and you get the Back in Time, and then you can just go completely crazy. I've done that once. It was really good, but if I've only assembled that once in 800 hours, that should tell you something about how unlikely that is. Just too hard to make it work, man. It asks you to do too much for what is admittedly a very nice benefit. Next up, we have Calculated. Man, another C. Not a good start to the rares. It feels bad, man. Future Strike triggers every 3rd turn. Apply vulnerable 1 to all enemies each turn. So, in the same way that I said that accelerating the pace at which your Future Strike triggers isn't actually a huge benefit, decelerating the pace at which it triggers isn't actually a huge downside either, which is kind of interesting. Also worth noting, this will cause Future Strike to trigger on turns that it would not otherwise trigger on. Right, so you're going to get a Future Strike on turn 3 that wouldn't normally happen. You're going to get a Future Strike on 6 that would normally happen. It's kind of on and off. Sometimes that's relevant given enemy patterns. But in general, even though it's not a huge downside, it is still a downside to not get your Future Strike as quick, because that could make you stick around for an extra turn, right? If you would have normally killed the enemy with the turn 4 second Future Strike trigger, and instead your Future Strike triggered on turn 3, and then on turn 4 nothing, and on turn 5 nothing, and then on turn 6 you get to kill the enemy. Now, you know, you could have seriously taken a lot of damage or even died in that time. Also working against Calculated is the very unfortunate fact that 1 vulnerable every turn means you are vulnerable every turn if you're playing with all for 1 on, which is generally a very good modifier to have enabled. The upgrade on this one, making it cost less, is pretty crucial as well. It's pretty dang expensive getting this thing into play at 2. It doesn't do anything the turn you play it. It's at the start of the turn when you get the vulnerable out there, so that's perhaps worth noting, although not really, because if you're using it with Future Strike, all that matters is that it's triggering on that turn. Very infrequently have I made use of Calculated. I just think it comes up short too often. Next up, we have a rare that is not C tier. It's Epiphany, and Epiphany is B tier. It's kind of interesting. I think this would be a stronger card on any other class, but Enlightened can actually struggle to spend 4 energy in a turn. Believe it or not, right? Like, if you play a 1-cost, a 1-cost, a 1-cost, you go Zen. That's 3 energy spent. All your 1-costs while you're in Zen now are free. It can actually be tricky to get that 4th energy spent. But it's not impossible, of course, and you'll definitely be triggering it some of the time, which means you're drawing some number of cards. So if we think of the cost of this in terms of energy and the energy value of the cards you're drawing, it's pretty easy to make up the difference. You upgrade this thing, it's rigged, that's pretty nice. You put a Blackstone in this thing, double Epiphany triggers both of the Epiphanies on the turn you've played them, that's really good. And it's a good effect to stack. Drawing more cards is good. So, yeah, I mean, it reads like an incredibly powerful card, but pretty often by the late game, your decks are so efficient that you won't be spending that much energy, and you will be surprised at how often you don't trigger Epiphany, but you won't trigger it infrequently enough to make it bad. It's definitely still a good card, so B tier. Next we have Haste. Haste is going to be A tier. This turn, dealing Future Strike deals damage for the same amount. So it's kind of like Timeless, right? Timeless, if you upgraded it, it was Future Strike plus She. She is better than damage, of course, but Haste costs 1 less, and it does that without an upgrade. So that is pretty good. As for what its upgrade actually is, it's just Opener Chain 1, which is fine. Obviously, you want to play this effect early before you've done your Future Striking. So that's pretty reasonable. It's a good effect. It's a little situational in terms of the deck it fits into, but even outside of like a super heavy Future Strike deck, playing this one card and just being one ability away from Zen, and then having this nice little lingering effect that is a bonus for the rest of the turn is still pretty respectable. And in the decks where you do have a lot of Future Strike, this thing can go absolutely crazy. So definitely a big fan of Haste. Next we have Meditation. Meditation will also be A tier. This is a pretty interesting card. For 2 energy, start your next turn in Zen, Expel. And if you're in Zen when you purge this thing, you gain 1 energy. So that's a pretty strong effect. I was going crazy over Reflect being purge, gain 1 energy. Well, this says purge, gain 1 energy too. You do have to be in Zen, so it is, you know, a little bit tougher to get than the Reflect effect, but still pretty good. The ability to go Zen next turn is nice for setting up like really big damage dealing turns, which goes nicely with stuff like Foresight, or not Foresight, Vision, excuse me. I mean Foresight too, to an extent. Also though, if you upgrade this thing, it immediately puts you into Zen when you play it, and that's a very big deal. 2 turns in a row where you're just going to have an instant free Zen, more or less. Quite nice, quite nice. There's a couple ways to use this card, really. Like, you know, it saves you energy if you use it immediately, and it saves you energy next turn. It lets you set up big damage turns. You can purge it to gain energy reliably. I like it a lot. It's very flexible, and all of the things you can do with it are good, so that's an A tier card. Path to Enlightenment. This is a really good one as well. This is also an A tier card. Block 5 for 1, that's not super good. Draw 1, upgrade the card for the rest of the battle, discard. That's very good. Rebound, that's very, very good. And especially if you upgrade it so that you're drawing and discarding 2 cards. Really powerful, man. Really, really powerful. This is a great way to cycle through the deck, which is 1 card you can draw and discard 4. That's insane. The fact that it's upgrading the drawn cards does actually kind of matter. As, you know, I said with Better Future, you're upgrading your best cards, but what you're not upgrading a lot of the time is your some of the filler cards, some of the cards that just hung around because you don't happen to have anything better. This will just incidentally upgrade those, and if you do end up playing them that fight, well, now you've got some extra value out of it. That's pretty good. It's a great stone carrier because it rebounds. It's just really good. It's a great card. I don't know what else to say. Prophesized is up next, and Prophesized is also an A tier card. Finally, we've gotten to the good rares. For 3 cost, deal 3 She a number of times equal to 9 minus this card's energy cost. So by default, 3 She 6 times is, you know, I mean, that's not astounding for 3 energy, but it's good scaling. Obviously, though, of course, you can reduce its cost. If you're in Zen, now it's 2, so you're getting an extra 3 She. And if you upgrade it, it goes down to 2 cost itself. So that's, you know, the baseline now. And then if you go into Zen, it's only a 1 cost. And obviously what you're meant to do with this card is just 4C it. And then it's 3 She 9 times. And that's very powerful. If you have a ton of Foresight, you don't even need the upgrade. So that's pretty cool. It is just it's a really good way to deal a lot of She. One of the best ways to deal a lot of She. Probably the best way to deal a lot of She. Not including the stupid escalate stuff. So, yeah, that's an A tier. And the next one is an A tier as well. It's just an A tier Parade. Reverb. This is another one of those cards where it's like, maybe you could argue this one's S tier, because when it goes off harder than almost anything in the game. Apply fatigue to all enemies equal to Echo Wall, but reduce your Echo Wall to 0. that's ridiculous. You can get like 10 fatigue to all enemies based off of this. It's insane. If you upgrade it, it's also hitting everyone with She. For some inexplicable reason, it just I don't know why it needs to be able to do that. It just can. It's so strong. But you don't always have a lot of Echo Wall, right? Sometimes you have a bunch of stoicisms and you've got no Condo and you're cycling through your deck really quickly and it's really, really, really good. Other times you have like almost no Echo Wall and you're using this to apply like 1 or 2 fatigue and it's okay, right? Like, obviously, I said that 3 energy for 1 fatigue on Run Ragged was good. Reverb can be a lot better than that. But it is a rare, so the standards are higher. That's why it's not an S tier in that regard. But yeah, it is still a good card, right? If you have any Echo Wall, you should probably include this in your deck. If you have literally no Echo Wall, it's useless and you'll cry bitter tears, but that won't happen that often. And finally, ending things out, the last card, Thousand Fists. Thousand Fists, we're going out on a high note here. It's an S tier card. This thing's crazy. 7 Future Strike 2 times for 2. If the target is slow, trigger +1. Not super impressive, actually, but once you upgrade it, if you're in Zen or the target is slow, trigger +1. Yeah, that's very good. That's very, very good. This can be your one-stop shop for damage. You can go an entire run where this is the only card you have that deals any meaningful amount of damage, and it's no big deal. You mix in some vision, you put a black stone on it or something, right? It rewards you for going Zen, which you already want to do. You stack it up like nobody's business. It benefits from rage. It benefits from vulnerable. It scales reasonably well with fatigue. It does everything you could ever want from a damage card. It is the pinnacle of Future Strike-based damage. So, has to get an S tier for that. And that will wrap up the tier list here. So, thanks everybody for watching. Again, if you haven't seen the other tier lists, make sure to check those out. We've done Tempest cards, and hidden artifacts. Next up is probably going to be the Tempest Artifact tier list. If you're enjoying the content, make sure to give the video a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more runs, more tier lists, and peace out.